I hope everyone is well rested since we last met, and we have an exciting program today, quite a full one as well, but I thought that we'd have a quick recap of our discussions yesterday. So it's linked to the themes that we have set out. If you recall the slide that was shown at the start of yesterday's session, we highlighted 4 themes for yesterday. So if we look at these particular themes, so in thinking about emerging trends in the regulation of AI-based medical devices, there are some shared interest or consensus points, so to speak. We think that these regulatory approaches should be values-based or based on a set of values. They should be adaptive, responsive, transparent, participatory, and of course, exhibiting related characteristics. So they should ideally identify red lines. But there are questions as to what exactly this could mean, given that, as we've heard, these AI-based devices are like boundary objects. So depending a bit on the context and the use, so their nature itself may vary, and therefore if we think about how to regulate such a device, then it can be rather challenging. So when we think about drawing red lines, right, this could be a particular challenge. The regulatory approach should ideally be holistic, because as we've seen, right, the current regulatory landscape is rather fragmented and in many ways unclear as well. So there are a number of open questions which include whose values are being implemented and what sort of values there are that are currently being animated or taken up, whether it's by the developers or within systems. So we could think about these, for example, in rather individualistic terms, quite in line with precision medicine and related initiatives. It could be market-based or perhaps communal, if we think about it as being implemented within a particular setting. So these are all the possibilities. But I left that out, of course, that there could also be political values, depending on how we think about that. So there's some open questions there. The other question would be what is to be fully animated, the degree of animation. So what exactly is to be animated and to what extent? So it could be fully, it could be partial, or perhaps in line with the red line kind of approach, right? There are certain things that perhaps should not be automated. So there are ongoing questions about how to implement particular regulation if we have a particular approach in mind, and also how to evaluate the regulatory approach. So that's another challenge. And there's been a number of discussions around how to engage, with whom to engage, and how involved the engagement should be. So not a whole lot of clarity when we think about a variety of regulatory approaches. So of course, these are only indicative. If you feel that there are any other points that haven't been picked up, please do feel free to let me know. So there will be some time for open discussion here. So thinking again about the regulatory trends, we will continue this discussion in relation to data governance for this afternoon, and then returning more broadly to the broad agenda of regulation, right, this evening in the public session. So where gaps are concerned, I thought there's been quite a number of interesting discussions as to how harms are to be understood. So there are various constructions. We haven't been very specific about what exactly they could mean, but as we think about data, this is one possible development that could follow from today's discussion. There's been a number of discussions in relation to accountability, lack of clarity as to standards that would apply, and of course the liability issue. So for example, it was noted that existing standards or regimes that could be defined within consumer protection laws or otherwise in tort law may not be entirely fit for purpose. So, so that's perhaps one of the very apparent gaps that was evident in our discussions yesterday. There's also been, at least the way that I understand some of the discussions and concerns expressed over narrow value premises. And by this, I mean currently, if we think about existing regulatory regimes, they are primarily focused on safety, clinical efficacy, efficiency, and then, of course, a theme that will continue on today, right? Considerations of personal data privacy, principles or concerns. So we could broadly understand this to be privacy. But of course, if we refer to privacy as a concern and we link it up to a particular regulatory approach, such as the one that's defined under the GDPR, then privacy, of course, will be linked to a number of data protection principles. So privacy will be understood, for example, in terms of lawfulness of processing of data, in terms of transparency, in terms of data minimization. And of course, these principles are clear, important, but of course, very customized, directed at particular concerns, but perhaps not so much addressing other kinds of broader concerns. There are also variable degrees of enactment, so which means these values being taken up to varying degrees. I think that's something that we could consider further in today's discussion where data is concerned. There may also be a lack of oversight or safeguard where more general concerns are implicated. So, for example, if we think about issues of bias, equity, vulnerable populations, I think speakers have highlighted a number of concerns on these fronts. There are, as we have also heard, particularly from our clinician colleagues, right, a number of adoption challenges. So we could contrast that with development. So as far as development is concerned, there will be a set of concerns because this linked to existing regulatory provisions on medical devices. But then when we think about adoption, there may be unclear systemic, institutional, as well as professional oversight mechanisms, as well as standards. So these are, again, some of the points that have come out from yesterday's discussions. So where potential gaps are concerned, a number of speakers have noted that there isn't a lot of clarity in terms of oversight outside of the research domain. Because where research is concerned, of course, we have IRBs or RECs involved, but even in that context, there are a number of issues. But beyond this infrastructure that is currently in place, there's a lack of clarity as to the sort of oversight, apart from presumably privacy concerns where personal data protection regimes apply. So in jurisdictions where you do not find these sorts of regimes, then it may be even more problematic. There may be a lack of clarity as to ethical standards, even where there are such standards, the way that these standards are being implemented, for example, by different IRBs or RECs. I've noted that there may be some ambiguity as to risk evaluation threshold. So what might be interesting is, of course, if we think about the current approach adopted by the US FDA or the NMPA on mainland China, this notion of a predicate device that's used as a measure for typically moderate risk devices. So this would be class 2 essentially by the FDA and the NMPA standard. So how comparable essentially would one particular device be to something that's already in existing use, and then the sort of considerations around that. So some ambiguity in terms of the risk evaluation practices as well as threshold. And finally, in terms of gaps, how involved should stakeholders be? So this is a point that's related to something that we mentioned earlier on as well. So for instance, the extent of information to be shared in consent taking, where this applies, And then also a number of rather interesting discussions around going beyond a function-based kind of engagement. So as we have heard, where these devices are concerned, they are regulated based on specific indicated functions. So if we think of deep learning, where these functions could change over time, depending on the degree that these devices could function autonomously, right? Then what sort of engagements do we need to have in place for a variety of purposes, whether it's oversight or review, subsequent change? So that's another avenue to consider. And of course, with additional functions, the types of stakeholders involved may also change as a result. So some questions on that particular issue as well. And finally, if we think about ethical issues and considerations, I think this shouldn't be surprising to everyone in the audience. We may pick up on some of this and compare that with the data practices and data mechanisms that are in place. So informed consent, risk evaluation, transparency, privacy. Again, privacy, it's something that we can unpack further in the context of today's presentations. Equity, bias, discrimination, how do we deal with these sorts of concerns? Questions over control of the device, and in today's context, control of the data, including ownership concerns. Like, we didn't really go into the ownership questions in this particular conference. There might be a subsequent discussion around this. Of course, then it would involve a number of IP-related practices, but we can save that discussion for a separate time. But of course, there have been some issues highlighted in relation to this question. Again, the participation question, liability was something that was highlighted a number of times, accountability, questions about access to the device, so the sort of assurances or safeguards that need to be in place, and then of course the more procedural kind of concerns linked to oversight and implementation, as well as the practices. So I don't know if this has captured all the points. If you do have any other points that you think I've missed, please do let me know. So that's in relation to all of the various themes. As we see, still rather open questions. Hopefully we'll get to pick up on some of these this evening when we return to the discussion on device regulation, and especially for tomorrow, because tomorrow we will be hopefully dealing with these questions in the context of the Greater Bay Area. So then where we do have a somewhat clearer notion of the sort of practices and context that we're dealing with, right? Hopefully it would also lend some clarity to these particular questions. So anyone with any comments at all? Just to open the floor up in case you would like to add any points to this. Well, if not, thank you so much. If anything else comes to mind, please feel free to let me know. We're likely to write this up and then circulate the document to all participants. If anything else comes to mind at all, please feel free to let us know, and then we'll add that on. It's meant to be a living document, so to speak. So if things come on, just feel free to add that. We might use Google Doc just to harness the potential of blockchain, but well, we'll see. Additional technological capability. So with this, many thanks again for all your contributions, for all the wonderful presentations and insights from yesterday. So today we are going into, as I've mentioned, the data space. So broadly speaking, if we consider day one to relate essentially to the computational aspects, so we think of devices as software, for example. So today, we're going to think harder about the data aspect. So there's some discussions as to whether the data could be or should be separated as a concern from device. But if we look at the regulatory regimes, right, there are different provisions, one speaking specifically to device, as we've seen, and then, of course, as we'll consider today, very specific provisions addressing data-related concerns, particularly identifiable data. So we are going to start off our presentation with Professor Mascalzoni. So Deborah is, as you see, has done a lot of work in this space. In case, well, for those who don't know, she is Italian, so which is why she's talking about Italy, although the institution identified on the program would be Swedish, Uppsala. Or perhaps she could draw insights from Sweden as well.
Yes.
Okay, that would be brilliant.
A double affiliation there, so
yeah, that's brilliant. So we get a bonus, so to speak, having to hear about two different jurisdictions in one presentation. So what's perhaps really helpful to mention here, as you see on her biography in the program, is that she's been intricately involved in the development of CRIS as part of the UREC research initiative. So Deborah is going to introduce us to UREC, which I believe Kiera is going to speak about as well, touching to, no, oh, okay, sorry, yeah, so maybe not. So we'll just rely on Deborah to speak to this. And you find that, of course, she has also been collaboratively with her IT colleagues responsible for the development of a dynamic platform. So wonderful initiative to consider if we're thinking about involving participants in a more active way. So so Deborah, I'm not sure to what extent you're going to speak about that, but we'll be keen to hear more about your insights that you could share on this particular development. So with this, thank you so much, Deborah. It's over to you.
So Calvin, thank you for having us here. By the way, it's really like a pleasure. And today, I wanted to have a little bit of a focus on the impact that different regulation can have on the use of data and how this use of data in turn can have an impact on artificial intelligence developments. And especially, we're going to focus on genomic data here because the projects and the examples that I'm bringing into the floor are coming from projects that are working with genomic data. Now, as we all know, there was a huge debate in the past years about genomic data, and a lot of work has been done in trying to frame and to build governance frameworks that were very solid for this type of data. So how is AI changing the game? Well, we know that actually artificial intelligence is already in the genomic data realm because we are using artificial intelligence to analyze data, but also we need data coming from genomics to train and to develop artificial intelligence in turn. So it's really like a cycle that we need to consider. But how is, the frameworks that we have been developing changing? How is it changing? How is it affected by these new technologies? Well, we know that the use of data that we are envisaging right now with the development of AI technologies is really changing a lot. And it goes far beyond the traditional use of data for medical research and the technologies that we have been using so far. So one example comes from Sweden, and is the Oncologics project, in which AI-based decision support for better treatment of colorectal cancer is developed. This is a collaboration with Indiera PerMed framework. And the goal is really to use a huge wealth of data coming from the patient's acts and the genomic profile, both of patients and of the tumor, in order to stratify and based on the unique genotypic and phenotypic characteristics, find new ways to treat and to, have even new diagnosis. Of course, this is, fraught with implications, both legally and ethically. We saw some yesterday, liability, but also trust, relationship between doctors and patients. And, even asking patients and informing patients about being part of such a process, as was touched yesterday by Alessandro Blasime, is really a challenge. So there are actually challenges for the research setting and of the ethical and legal framework that we have been developing so far. So on the one hand, we really want to avoid bias, and here I'm really super simplified in the argumentation, but so you need to access solid data sets, really most of the data that you can access, and those data sets need to be representative and good, etc. Yesterday, we really saw very good examples on that. But on the other hand, we really want that this use of data is respecting participants' rights. And again, here I'm summarizing in 2 words, 10 years of ethical debate. But finding this balance really means not to forget all the work that has been done so far. So yes, we are introducing a new technology. Yes, we are changing the work, but maybe we want some of the old work to stay in as well. So to do so, we really need to account for limits that are posed by current governance frameworks, limits posed by the different laws and regulatory frameworks, and limits that we should consider as society. Here, there are some examples. Yesterday, we saw that Italy became the first Western country to ban ChatGPT for a little while. And there are still doubts there, but also there is this social call to, put some limits to the development of the AI. Coming back to the legal framework, we know that there are different frameworks that are developed, and I will focus on Europe just because I know only about Europe. So I'm here to learn. And there are new regulatory approaches that are actually already impacting data's usage, and that will in turn impact AI development and training. So all of us know the General Data Protection Regulation. Maybe what is a bit unknown is that the General Data Protection Regulation is probably 50 different general data protection regulations, and how they are, interpreted by the different countries in Europe. So from this discrepancy in the interpretation, we have here 2 examples on how the regulations could develop. So on the one side, we have the European Health Data Space, and Kira Staunton later will explain you a lot about that. And on the other hand, the Italian interpretation from the national authority. So I call this schizophrenic approach to interpretation of the GDPR. So on the one hand, you have, well, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but let's say they really have 2 opposite approaches. Now, to illustrate that, I will use a case study coming from Italy, which is the CRIS study. So the cooperative health study in South Tyrol is a longitudinal study collecting data very widely. So lifestyle data, genetic data, biosamples from 13,500 individuals that are involved over a 25-30 years project that started in 2011, and we're now in the 2nd phase. So it's quite a large project. Essential for the participation, because this is a healthy population, so it's not patients, it's like people that voluntarily come to the center to be part of the study, is trust. How do we ensure trust and participation and compliance with the study? Well, we need to build ongoing relationships with them. It's not, something that we can do, it's something that we must do. And to do so, we will need clear information pathways and respect for their needs. So the idea is really, to go from a framework in which we are talking about research subjects towards something more in which participants are more seen as stakeholders, partners. So from a them and us towards a us together type of approach. And how do we do that? Well, in different ways, but definitely communication and information is really, really paramount. So yesterday, I mentioned that I'm more interested in the ethical dimension of information and consent than on the legal piece. Because to me, in order to have a legal piece that is meaningful, you really need to have it embedded into an ethical dimension. So caring about contextual information, using different media to address different needs of the people, communicating over time and not one time is really one important point. So we really use also all the tools that technologies offer us. So we're talking about AI. So why is ethics using 24 written pages of information for the people? Let's use technology to address technology, I would say. And in this regard, we can really, learn a lot from advertisement, movies, and ways of communication that are a little bit out of the box, but can really provide us useful tools. So the idea of dynamic consent is based on that, on dynamic information. And dynamic consent is an IT-based informed consent that allows people more than consent, actually. It provides ongoing information about study and secondary studies that may start. It entails a consent manager that allows them to make changes about their preferences, for instance, about information, about secondary use, about new studies. But also, it gives the possibility to grant access and to revoke access to new studies and new aspects that we want to introduce in the project, making it really interactive. And of course, the ways to connect with people are different, not only IT-based, but also some are, still letter-based for the people that are not yet into the IT version. So the idea is really, to go beyond. So we really wanted to go towards a knowledge-based, dynamic, interactive consent process that is not just, providing the legal basis for study, but also like really conveying some values into the process. And to do that, we also built the governance of the study that is really, the framework in which you can only move with something like that together with the participants. It means that all the policy that has been developed for the project has been developed together with the participants and tested with the participants. This is why, we think that involving the public before something is started is really, really important, because the policies that you develop respond to their needs and not to what you think their needs are. So both risk consent, ethical framework, access policies, sharing policy, ethical oversight, etc., are really discussed with them. So now, how are those regulations and the potential use for artificial intelligence affect this example that I'm giving you? Because we built this fantastic framework for the people, with the people, and now we are faced with something like this. If I can change slide potentially. So technology is not always a friend. So where is participant autonomous choice going with the new regulations? Well, on the one hand, we have the European Health Data Space that provides a framework for a wide use of data in which we can go beyond what has been consented to, for instance. And actually, even if it is contrary or against what people agreed upon in the informed consent. On the other hand, and Kira will explain a lot about the European Health Data Space here, just take for granted this. I mean, someone else can decide about the use of data, even if people didn't agree on that. On the other hand, we have the Italian authority, and the Italian authority just in June last year issued an opinion in which he states that we actually need to go for specific consent for every and each use of data, and that broad consent is not allowed ever. So this was a complete shock for the research community because, going back for every and each use may entail that we have to contact people 5-10 times per month, which is not what people want. So participants' policy, people wishes, people rights kind of are not in one side nor on the other side. I think we're really facing the two extremes here. So the impact of the Italian Garante approach would really, bring the project to death in short time, because we know that every time we ask for active consent to the court, so asking them to actively, go in and say yes, we lose 30% or so of the court, while we know that they want to be in research and they do want to be informed. So opt-out options are super fine with them, but they don't want to have to be burdened all the time to go in. So what we have now is a current block on the reuse of sharing of data following this regulation, and unless specific consent for every use is obtained, we are just stuck. So the European Health Data Space potential impact on the study is actually the same, because if we completely lose trust for the CRISP Biobank, if they just discover that, for instance, we use data for, let's say, artificial intelligence development without them knowing, without them being informed, without them having a say, we will just, lose their trust, because they would feel fooled. Oh, yes, you did all this policy building with us, and now you do whatever you want. So we really need to be careful to keep into account what we have been building so far. So you will hear about the European Health Data Space later, but what I want to focus on is that both approaches are somewhat having an impact that is not sustainable, and we need to find something in the middle. Something in the middle that could even be, what has been recently proposed by TEDAS and the Council of Europe, something that is very similar to thick information plus opt-out options, that is also very much in line with the policy that we have been developing with the people and really reflects their will. So we really think that here communication is key. And coming back to artificial intelligence, we really need to take it seriously and communicate what is what, in order to distinguish and frame what is useful from what is fearful and scary. And I will conclude with two articles, one that was published yesterday and one that was published this morning, about, the societal worries about artificial intelligence. When we talk with people, with participants, we need to be aware that this is what they're reading. Therefore, communication is really paramount if we really want to exploit and develop the useful part of artificial intelligence. And we know we need to have a careful, usage of that to frame it, to regulate it, etc. And we need to take into account that this is what people fear, and those worries are serious and need to be addressed and need to be distinguished from what we are developing in different realms. So I leave you with this reflection. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Mascalzoni. In the interest of time, I'm sorry, we have to move on, but we will return to a number of points raised already in the very first presentation. So thank you so much again, Deborah. Thank you. So our next speaker is Professor Johanna Blom. So she's going to speak to us about yet another important initiative in Europe. Johanna, as you see, is medically trained. She's done a lot of fascinating work linked to what Deborah has been speaking to us about. She is, I believe, Dutch, but based in Italy. So very interesting. I see a movement of talent across different parts of Europe. So, Johanna, welcome again, and the floor is yours.
So, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's very refreshing seeing new faces, because I don't know anybody of you except Deborah and Kira, who are part of the project I'm going to present you. And it's always very nice to have opinions from people you have never heard of in terms of professional contribution. So what I'm going to present, the title of today's talk is Data Governance in the Facilitate Project, Defining the Elephant in the Room. I'm presenting to you a European project. It's a IMI project, a joint undertaking, which is mentioned before. It's a public-private grant where industry and academia and the regulators try to resolve an important problem. And it actually, the title is a framework for clinical trial. So it's really focused on clinical trial research and data return and secondary use of clinical trial data. So it's very fast. It's a project that will take or takes 4 years, and we are a year and a half into it. It has a relatively small budget for European standards, and but it has a lot of partners. We are 28 and from 16 countries, and almost equally, not entirely, divided by industry, FPA partners, so from pharmaceutical industry, and partners from hospitals, academia, and Iraq is also a partner. We have several safeguards. We have many boards of experts that help us in keeping the right direction, because it is a very complicated project. Why? Because we're dealing with something, with the elephant in the room. So how are we going to return clinical trial data to participants, and how are we going to build in a process to be able to use clinical trial data for secondary research purposes? The only thing we based it on one basic principle, and that is shaping a patient-driven, trusted legal ethical framework. Then that is combined to technical platform, which is going to test a prototype process. So it's not a prototype product, it is a process we are going to test and work with. So the two main purposes and directions we are going is to try to harmonize what is legally and ethically present. But the present is not interesting. You harmonize it, you see where you start from, but you have to look at the future, which for now seems far ahead if we are dealing with return and reuse. So how to create a governance system that allows that? Well, we are ambitious. We try to come up with a new legal ethical framework. That doesn't mean we can ignore the GDPR. We actually have to work around it, I think, and maybe make a little hole in it. As I see it, it's like a rock, right? If there's a little hole and there's water in it and water becomes ice, the rock splits at some point. And I think that is what we should do carefully if we want to invent something new. So, or more doable with the GDPR. It's based on a partnership, and I come back to that. We have to create clearer rules. For now, they are not clear enough to allow a new way of approaching clinical trial data. And eventually, who is going to benefit from them? I hope the patient, because I'm a clinician, but certainly industry has another take on it. What were the driving forces? Because now, if I look at facilitate and I read the description of action, it seems old sometimes, because we started writing it 2.5 years ago, more even. And since then, the European Health Data Space and many other initiatives have come in and moved ahead very fast. Maybe not with content, but with intention, yes. So we started off from what was then the status quo. It was trust, yes, but not really if I talk about return and reuse. The privacy by design and default at that point didn't work for predictive analytics. The right to opt out, but how? And the question, like you asked, what is the tension between opt-in and opt-out? And there is real tension. There is another way of looking at it in the United States. There are other rules. There are other there's other frame of dealing with it. Informed consent. I just was in Brussels, and there is a whole lot of people that think, is consent really the basis that we should use? So that is another discussion. And then you ask, okay, maybe not, but what is the explain what the true alternative is in terms of safety, in terms of safeguards. But it's a very important discussion which we started from. Data ownership, who owns the data? And what is the real problem? Is it a problem of return? In fact, it's a problem of access most of the time. So if you are trying to define the elephant in the room, which is the problem here at hand, you have to consider where the elephant is. And as in the Little Prince, is this that you can define a head, but you might figure out that in the end, this is not a head. And that is what we are doing. And I'm looking at it sometimes at the project. I'm like, what are we dealing with? The driving force of facilitate is create a road, create a process to comprehensive government. And that is based on a flow, a logical flow, which is missing. Most of the time we jump from one thing to the other. And it all seems very reasonable until you put it in a logical flow. Fairness. We have not talked about that much, but yesterday it was mentioned. Respect for patients and participants means truly considering their perspectives, not by paying lip service. Like, yeah, we will ask the patient. Accountability is also based on co-creation and alignment. Where are we going? Do we truly have the same objectives? Or I pretend I have the same objective, but underneath I want something else out of it. We are walking into these things because there is tension between private and public partnerships. And you get to them once you are creating. So what we came up with is this architecture, which is sort of new. We're not building a pyramid based on a layered ethical, then governance, or the other way around, legal, then ethical, then. We're trying, and that is the elephant in the room, probably, to build a cohesion between ethical and legal. And that is a problem of tension. It is where are we going with a minimum legal constraints and maximum ethical attention, or is it the other way around? What do you want from it? What is doable and what is workable within the legal constraints that Europe is imposing, because this is a European project. This is not that interesting. What is interesting about this slide is, there are two central work packages, which one is ethical, one is legal, work package 2 and work package 3. And together they fit into the technical part where we build a prototype process. So they are at the base and they remain the main feed for where we are going, where we're taking our governance. Now, if you talk about governance, I think you have to ask two questions. How are you going to provide governance? And what are you governing? So here, how to provide governance, you talk about processes, ethical frameworks, legal frameworks in a pyramid way. Then what are you going to govern? Data return, infrastructure, the technical framework, and secondary use. How? By a co-creation process. Align and then govern. You can turn those things around. You can say, okay, co-create, govern, and align. I think governing comes at the end of it, because you first have to be able to agree on something and then go ahead. What are the driving forces? The driving forces and the endpoint is building a very strict minimum guardrails. And within those red lines, you can have a flexible, adaptable process. Because what we need to do in our project, and I think in the larger sense, is anticipate change. We have to build in the possibility for change. We are going so fast that change is the word we use most. But if we cannot anticipate change, we always walk behind. We always one step behind. So we have to anticipate it. We have to become more accountable, and these safeguards do not have to be that much. Otherwise you cannot be flexible. We have to adapt, be able to adapt, and you can adapt if you foresee. So it's a circular reasoning here. What can we do? Strike a balance and these words have been used. And I think at the end of these 3 days, what we walk away with is words like trust, words like transparency, words like flexibility and adaptivity. Why? Because they're missing. If you what is trust? You know, we have to trust, we have to create trust. People have to, why don't they have trust? Well, we should ask ourselves that, fill it in. Because if you ask a patient if they want to share their data and they have a sick child, I work with children, nobody is going to deny you that. If they feel that you care for what you're doing. So care, being involved, is a first step. I was talking with a colleague in the United States, and Pfizer is launching very shortly their platform, and they're really created an interesting return of data platform. And guess what? The rate limiting step in getting people to buy into it, or it's an opt-in system, is the healthcare provider. It's the physician that has to make them sign up. So it's us, it's me, it's my fellow clinicians. So where trust comes from? First thing is, who cares for you? In what way? And that is very important to take into Facilitate, and probably it is the part that is underrepresented. So governance in Facilitate is how to provide it by processes, and this is adapted from WHO toolkit. Planning, compromising. You can align, you cannot align. So now we have the same direction. It's a compromise. It's a continuous compromise. But compromise is good. You can come up with something new and something that provides a future view. Coordination, and the last thing, sustainability. How are you going to deal it in the near future? How are you going to sustain a process like that? So we're working for the future of Facilitate in the next project right now. Build structure, organize, roles and responsibility. Don't invade other people's space, but know what your role is. Relationships, that's the most important part. And oversight. Who is going to be the one or the ones or the decision boards that help and account? And then the stakeholders, and that is probably the principal part. Patients, participants, and society at large. And yes, okay, then there are the private and public partners, stakeholders. But we start with patients and we end with patients. And so trust is a cornerstone, and it cannot be just a term we use. It has to be solidarity based. And sometimes you talk about a social contract. I don't think social contract is a good idea. I think a social alliance, like a clinical alliance, is, because then you put the patient and the clinician and the other stakeholders on the same level. An alliance is something we do on the same level. A contract might have differences in roles and feel like imposed. So a solidarity, social alliance-based approach, reciprocity, and mutual collective accountability. Those are the things that build trust. And so if we want to fill in the crucial part in which Facilitate turns, we have to define trust. Right now, EMA, important regulatory bodies are looking at us because, you know, we are small enough. We are like a playground for the big guys. We are in the middle, but it is an interesting space because you can actually try out new things. And so EMA is watching us, FDA is watching us. We are talking with them for future development of the project. And from the start, we had an important eye, and that's the theme of this conference, on technology, because part of data return and incorporating data is looking at real world evidence and at what phases a trial have, follow-up. Where are you going with your clinical trial? You stop? Well, if you stop and you abandon a patient, which is what is happening, that is not creating trust. But if you say right from the start, hey, you are taking part in this clinical trial, I'm taking care of you, and I'm not abandoning you after the trial stops, people think this might be worthwhile. I can get something out of this that is more than a clinical trial. But then we have to be intelligent and incorporate different types of data and embrace artificial intelligence and machine learning, because the data are a lot. And we have to figure out how we're going to use it, how it is going to provide insight into the governance of clinical trial. So that means building in security, protection, and yeah, we talked a lot about blockchain potential, because that, if you explain it in the right words, might create trust, because then I feel protected. And so the patient is based on it. Okay, so we have to deal with a rich environment. Facilitate has to move within this environment, take into account what existing initiatives are doing, presenting us with. We have to consider the stakeholders, the regulators, the methodology, and the technology. So where are we right now with the project? Well, it's not easy to say elephant. You know, we started off like the 7 blind men trying to figure out what the exotic animal walking in town was. One was feeling the trunk, and one was feeling the leg, and everybody thought that the trunk was like a hose or a snake, and that was the elephant, or the leg was like a tree, and that was the elephant. And at the start, we were like that. We were like doing exceptional good work, but not bringing it together in something that looked like an animal. So where are we now? Yeah, we have an animal. We have an elephant. It's different animal. It's a different elephant, but it's becoming an elephant. And we are understanding how we can deal with each other's needs, with the ethical framework needs, with the legal provisions we have to build in, with the patient as a needy person. So the last thing is, by now, I know what is under the head. I think it's an elephant. My elephant is not really looking like that, but it's starting to work. And we have 2.5 more years in really making it work. So yeah, we are in progress. And I hope that maybe within a year or 2, I can tell you much more about it and definitely have a tangible process like solutions to some of the issues we've talked about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Blom. Let me ask if anyone or from the audience have got any questions for Professor Blom. Yes, ma'am, please go ahead. And then Dr. Bay.
Thank you very much. I have so many questions. And I also understand where the project is at the moment, in the sense that it's probably, there's still more to develop. So, I mean, just to have a better sense, one, may call it perhaps a more tangible issue relates to the nature of the data that's going to be returned. If there's any, maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that. I'll just give you background of why I'm asking this question is because sometimes, depending on what it is that we're returning, what it is that we're working with, it has either, very easy path towards it actually happening, or a lot of roadblocks that we need to work on very, very early on in the project to get out so that it could happen. And especially if this is something that spans across multiple jurisdictions. So maybe if you can maybe elaborate a little bit on the nature of the data.
I think what we have been trying to do, and Deborah's group has been heavily involved in that, is starting from the patients, from the need of their data. Now that means that you have different types of patients and different types of needs, and that has to be fed back to our industrial partners who are sharing use cases and on which we can build our process. So it depends on data. If you look at clinical trial data, you have 130 parameters, for instance, that you can measure, but you are not doing that in all trials, in all types of diseases, and with the needs of the patients in particular. So, what data are you looking? Clinical trial data that are returned to the sponsor, data that are in possession of the sponsor. Right now, if you have a patient enter a clinical trial and you ask the patient, did you get your data back? 85% said no, whatever data. So they participate, they allow their data to be used, but they do not get anything back other than maybe a summary. And I'm saying it because, it seems everybody, we can do a summary, we can use all the anonymized data and then tell you where the trial went, what was the outcome. But that is not interesting. Yes, it's interesting, but I have to look at my own data. And who is possessing the data? I would say the patient. It's my data. But that is not what is happening. So you ask me what data? Well, if you look at what you're going, there are data that are not included right now. There are genetic data. We're not talking about that much. There are behavioral data, psychiatric data. They are very sensitive. So most of the time you talk about lab data. That is a good idea. You can return it, avoid duplicating. Much data is actually not that complicated. What is the big question though? And that is the elephant in the room. What are you going to do with my biological sample in the future? Nobody's asking that. What data will come out of use of a stored biological sample? And that means access. Initially, who's going to access that? So data is a very wide concept. Depending if you have a cancer patient, you know what your data should look like, what is vital, what is predictive, what is needed for refining diagnostic parameters. But if you have a neurodegenerative disorder, that's completely different. You have other parameters, other data. So it depends on the patient, depends on the disease, it depends on what is exactly the product you're testing? How old is your population? What do they want out of it? If the patient is 25 years old, it has a complete different outlook on what they want for their future than if you have a 90-year-old person with Parkinson's disease. It's different. And we have to build in the flexibility to deal with different types of data, different types of diseases, different types of data sets, therefore. I don't know if that's answering your question.
Yeah, I have a lot of follow-up points, but I hopefully we can have a chance.
Yeah, we will
talk a little bit more.
talk about it.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Yeah, thanks so much. Hopefully there'll be opportunity later on to pick up on a number of points. We're hearing some, of course, very interesting projects that are already in implementation. We've heard from, of course, Professor Mascalzoni on the CRISP project, and then now facilitate and subsequently the EU data space. I have Dr. Bay next, and then Professor Flood.
Try to it speaks to all the good that we hope scientists and researchers and clinicians aspire to. However, that's where it stops, because I think most of us know the reality.
Yeah.
No matter how well funded or even how well regulated a lot of work is, there are so many loopholes, and even the return of data. Why? I mean, I shouldn't say why. I can return data to the patient, but that doesn't mean much if I still have a set that I've had centrally. So that's the other side of the coin that we haven't really quite addressed. And one of the earlier points was also predicting the future as to what may be done or what may be needed to be done. And take sequencing, for example. Not that long ago, we only talked about, well, the bits that really matter are only the coding regions. But increasingly now we are aware that a lot of importance is starting to creep in, that some of the non-coding regions are actually very important as well. But how do we even start thinking or talking about that, or even getting consent on the use of that? And that's where I feel, in a sense, what you've said makes so much sense from a clinician's point of view. Let's start with the patients. Let's talk about trust and doing what's right for the patient. But once it gets into multiple parties, stakeholders, public, private, research institutes, it's all a tug of war and in multi directions.
Yeah.
So I do wish you luck. I love to hear the conclusion of your work.
Yeah, but you are right. I mean, it is a project built on different, I would call it tension. If you look at engineering, there is tension. You have to somehow release that tension. And how can you do that? By building the structure more or better. And that is what we're trying to do. But yes, of course, the farther you go, the more complicated it gets. But not necessarily if your base is solid, because then you can feed with actionable steps the next layer. I'm not saying it's going to work, but I think we have to stop defining the presence, because that is not going to have us ahead. Now, it's not wishful thinking either. We're not doing an exercise of wishful thinking here, but just going back to the basics. And if you go back to the basics, you go back to the patient and to the relationship with their physician. And if we find that the physician is one of the bottlenecks, then definitely that is a target we have to work on.
So with this, again, thank you so much, Professor Blom, for the fascinating presentation. Thank you. And before our break, we are going to hear from Dr. Chiara Staunton. So Chiara, similarly impressive background, having done a lot of work in this space on research ethics, research governance. She is a legal scholar, but extremely well-versed in ethics. And she has, in recent years, been working closely within URAC, something that I've heard both Deborah and Johanna mention. But today, she's going to talk to us about the European data space, which is, I think, a very interesting initiative and something perhaps we could consider, or maybe not, for the GBA. So yeah, perhaps that contextual element we can save our discussion for tomorrow. But meanwhile, let's consider the situation in Europe. So welcome, Chiara.
Great. Thank you very much, Calvin, and thank you for the invitation to be here. It's been wonderful thus far. So I'm going to talk to you about a draft regulation that's been proposed. It is currently draft. The European Parliament has very recently commented and has issued a draft opinion. Rather optimistically, they hope to have this signed, sealed, and delivered by next year. It will not, but that is the aspiration. And what it's there's two pillars, but I'm going to focus on the data sharing aspect. And at the outset, I'm going to emphasize solely focus on data sharing. It's not concerned about access to any downstream interventions. It does not concern commercializations. So it's really not dealing with the difficult issues that we really need to encounter. So at the moment, the regulation of data in Europe is very much at a dynamic space. We are at a time of a lot of regulatory change, a lot of regulatory initiatives. We've had, of course, we all know about the GDPR. We've had across EU member states in the context of research, national governments have been allowed a degree of latitude, and they've introduced their own way of regulating the processing of data for research, which has resulted in a fragmented environment and very challenging for anybody who's trying to access data. The Commission is very aware of this. It has introduced strategies on data and data use. It has emphasized the importance of data sharing, highlighting the COVID pandemic. It is regulating AI, and I understand that the Parliament is hoping to sign off on the regulation tomorrow. We also have the Data Governance Act, which is focusing on public sector data and making it available for new products and services. But what I want to focus in on is the one on, I think it's your top right screen, which is the European Health Data Space. Now, the reason why this has been introduced is that there's concerns time and time again across Europe and the regulators and the Commission that we are lagging behind in Europe in research and innovation. Point to Asia, it's pointing to the US, and how there is a lot of innovation and commercialization of products there that can't happen in the current regulatory space in Europe because of over-regulation. And they also point to the GDPR. But at the outset, while I acknowledge this critique, I think it's important to remember in Europe, we're not lagging behind in rights protection. And this is something we should be proud of and continue to take a leading step across the world in how we actually regulate technology, innovation, and the use of data. So the European Health Data Space was introduced in May of last year. It's focused on two areas. One is on the primary use of data. One is on the secondary use of data. The primary use of data is all about focusing on giving patients more autonomy and control over the use of their health data. It's requiring the introduction of electronic health records, and it's also requiring what it wants to do is that it wants to enable for those of us in Europe who's like me, who moves around quite a lot, it wants us to be able to transfer our electronic health records as we move across jurisdictions. So I've lived in Europe, or Ireland, UK, Switzerland, and Italy. And rather than, as I have to do, set up a relationship with every GP, I can just bring my data with me. How realistic is that, considering I can't even move across a health district in Ireland? I'm not sure, but you know, we all like to hope. The focus I'm going to look on is on the secondary use of data. And so what this pillar on the secondary use of data wants to do is it wants to provide infrastructure and a legal framework to enable the secondary use of data. And when I talk about the secondary use of data, I'm referring to both personal and non-personal data. In the GDPR space, we focus on personal data and anonymized data. Do what you want. We're now looking at personal and non-personal data. And so at the outset, I also want to clarify that it's not about establishing a central EU database of health data. Rather, it wants to provide a structure, infrastructure, and a legal framework or a process to go about sharing the secondary use of data. And so when we talked yesterday about, what's the intention of the regulators, what are they seeking to achieve? This is their intention. They want to unleash the benefits of the secondary use of health data. That's actually what recital 38 says in the draft European health data space. I think on this phrase alone, we could have a whole conference. What do we mean by benefits? How are we going to unleash it? To whom are we going to unleash it for? And for what purpose? So when I talk about unleashing the benefits of the secondary use of health data, this is how the European Commission envisions that we should unleash the benefits of the secondary use of health data. But one thing we're not going to talk about here is benefit, because nowhere is that discussed. It is assumed that there is going to be a benefit, and it is assumed that we're going to access that benefit. So I acknowledge massive shortcoming, but I think this is a massive shortcoming when we're considering data governance and data sharing. Benefits is assumed, and most importantly, it's assumed we will all have access. I think COVID was one of the great data sharing experiments, and that really showed us that we can get, in theory, a benefit. But once it comes to access, economic and national interests will always take over. But moving on. So what is the overall, and I'm going to be very general, I'm not going to have time to into specifics, but what generally are they going to do? So subject to certain conditions being met, the European health data space is creating an obligation, a legal obligation on data holders to share electronic health data with data users for secondary purposes. So the conditions focuses mainly on data protection, purpose limitation, data minimization, with the assumption is, if it's non-personal, there's not too many criteria attached there. A data holder is any natural or legal person or an entity in the health or care sector, or who is performing research in relation to these sectors. So it's defined broadly as people are in our bodies in the health and care sector. They're the ones who have to make the data available. Who can access is a data holder. That's more broadly pretty much anyone who meets the conditions. So the other things we want to talk about is what is electronic health data and what are the secondary purpose. Electronic health data is defined in Article 33.1. A lot of text here, but here for any of you who's looking to access data to develop and trade medical AI, this is the kind of data you want to get. You have electronic health records, genomic data, you've got wellness applications included there. You've got all types of health related administrative data, biobank data, and so on. Now, the European Data Protection Board and the European Data Protection Supervisor has issued a joint opinion critiquing it on a number and recommending on a number of fronts. On this definition, one recommendation is take wellness apps out of this. It is not something that they think we should be allowing access to the secondary use. And that's for two reasons. One is quality. They don't really trust us to have good quality data, which I think we can accept. But they're also concerned about the amount of data that's included in wellness applications. It means a lot of inferences can actually be made about a person. So they have concerns on that. But for any of those of you who's looking to access data to develop and train medical AI, it's a potential treasure trove, both personal and non-personal. And now for the interesting part, secondary purposes. It does not refer to GDPR terminology. It talks about secondary purposes. There are 8 purposes for which you can access data for secondary use. These are not verbatim, but just for like aesthetics, I kind of reduced it down. So activities for reasons in the public interest in the area of public and occupational health. I think you can get medical AI into this definition. Development and innovation activities or products contribution to public health or social security. I think you can also get medical AI into that. Providing personalized care. Absolutely. Training, testing, and evaluation of algorithms, including medical devices, AI systems, and digital health applications. Scientific research related to health or care sectors. Now, there is what's being proposed under the draft opinion coming from the Joint Committee under the European Parliament. They recommend that any use of data for secondary purposes for AI needs a clear public health or social security contribution. So it can't be just assumed. You need to make a case. It doesn't go into what we mean by public health or social security, but they have raised caution on the use of data for AI. So we have a data holder. They must make data available for secondary purposes to a data user if conditions are met. So how do you go about applying for the data? You know, Deborah went in and explained to you our process for Chris, but this is how it's going to apply for all secondary purposes for both personal and non-personal data if this is passed. So we have a data holder. Chris would be a data holder. It must make a description of its data set available, and this must include the scope and the main characteristics and nature of the electronic health data. If an application has been approved, and a data permit has been issued to a data user, the data holder has an obligation to make that data available within 2 months. If not, they get a fine. It can be extended up to 4 months, but they must make this available. A data user will make an application to a new entity that has to be developed called a health data access body. There will be one in each member state. There can be a few in each member state, but they will be dealt with on the member state level. If you're looking for data sets, and again, for those of you who's looking to access data, this is going to make life easy. You're looking for multiple data sets across Europe, France, Germany, Ireland. Hell, you're looking for it in every member state. You only need to make an application for all of this data to one body. It's going to streamline it. It's going to make it easier for you to access the body. Now, the health data access body will have a data catalog. It won't actually have the data itself, but it will have the data catalog. It will process the application, make sure if it's personal data, adheres to the principles of data minimization, purpose limitation. Now, the focus on the trend in the European health data space is to anonymize where possible, because, obviously, because we all know the distinction between personal and anonymized data is super simple. That is what they want. If it's to anonymize, you need to make it clear how the safeguards are built in. They'll also be responsible for issuing the data permit, and they're going to be a yearly report on what data is being accessed for what purposes, which is important. It's transparent. We're telling people how their data has been used, which is good. We're going down that direction of communicating, potential benefits, use of the secondary use of data. And then what does the data user have to do? They have to use the data in line with the permit. So that is very briefly, broadly, what the system's going to be. Now, for those of you who are not in Europe and you're in a third country and you want to get access to the data, so for those of you here who want to have global data sets, we know there's problems in Europe getting data out, what do you do? If we're looking for personal data, we still have to adhere to the GDPR and all the issues there. You need to have a lawful basis, adequacy decision. If no adequacy decision, you're getting genomic data, it's going to be tough. For non-personal data, how do you go about, so we're talking about anonymous data, how do you go about and get access to that data? Well, it has this term that adopts from the Data Governance Act called highly sensitive data. And highly sensitive data is talking about non-personal data. And what the draft European health data space is that for electronic health records, genomic data, medical registries, biobank, or medical device is non-personal data. It says that more protective measures may need to be introduced depending on the nature of the data and the anonymization. Now, the draft opinion from the European Parliament has said that we need more rules on the transfer of non-personal data, which is highly sensitive. So they said we need more rules. So for anonymized data that falls in under these categories, it's not going to be as easy it used to be to get it out. We're going to have more rules. The proposal also introduced another caveat, as in the draft opinion, the recommendation to the Commission in revising this, that the transfer should be on the basis of the reciprocity principle. And what this means is that before it'll make data available to anybody who's outside of the EU, there must be a similar process or system in that country that allows, to us to get data based on that principle. So it's kind of going down the direction of the GDPR. You want our data, have a similar sense of protections. We're saying now, if you want access to our non-personal data, we must have a transfer basis on the principle of reciprocity. In theory, I think it's actually it's not a bad idea. Data sharing and reciprocity have often been talked about together. For a large piece of my research has been working in the African context. And there, when we talk about data sharing, reciprocity is always talked about. Reciprocity in the context of participants giving their data to the researchers, but also researchers giving their data out to high-income countries, transfer on the basis of reciprocity. Again, in theory, I like it, but I do have big concerns. Because if we are going to have a situation, South Africa is where I spent a lot of my academic career working. So I'm going to use as an example, South Africa has PAPIA, similar to GDPR, no adequacy decision, but it is in parts quite similar. If we go down the road of they get an adequacy decision, well, they won't under current, but let's pretend they have. And they have introduced an act that is similar to the European health data space. The concern I have is that it's much easier for us to exploit their data because we have the capacity. And now, if we're going to have this principle of reciprocity, is it going to cause a situation where it's more easier for high-income countries to access data in other parts of the world where they don't have the same capacity to exploit data? So in theory, I agree, but I do see problems maybe going down the implementation. So in a nutshell, that is a draft European health data space. So is it an exciting time for you who are looking to access data in Europe to develop and train AI? After all, we have a legal framework that they're hoping to harmonize everything across the European member states, and we get rid of all the fragmented problems that's had with the GDPR. For now, I say no, and there's three concerns. One I've already mentioned, and it's this third country transfers. I think it's going to cause even more problems in getting data out of Europe. But there's two other issues. It's not going to harmonize, and it does not also adequately consider the major issues we are grappling with. If we look first at harmonization, absolutely not. The road to harmonization is not complete at all. First of all, it does say that when we are dealing with personal data, national ethical rules still apply. So if you're somebody who wants data from 15 member states, you're still going to have to deal with the ethical rules in 15 member states. The European Commission does not have the competency to regulate ethics, even though everything it does with data has ethical implication. So there is no dividing line, and it's about time that they stop pretending that they do. But it's still not going to deal with the fact that we have different ethical rules on the use, and particularly we really see differences in European member states on the secondary use of data. Primary data is kind of quite similar, but secondary use of data, vast differences. A major problem is that the proposal is not congruent with national data protection laws as provided for in the GDPR and the implementation in the context of research. The joint opinion of the European Health Data or European Data Protection Board and Supervisor has flagged this. It says in Italy we have consent, and they're now saying we're going to replace this. but all of our processes in Italy has been developed telling our participants, we are going to use consent and we're going to use it in line with your consent. When how they're just going to say, I don't, never mind, we're just going to do it this way. It's not compliance with, and so we have a conflict of law situation that is somehow going to have to be addressed. It also says if consent of the national law is required, you actually just follow the procedure set out in the European Health Data Space. So even if consent is required in the national level, doesn't matter, you use the European Health Data Space. It's not clear if they're talking about consent as an ethical consent or consent as a legal basis for the processing. I suspect it is consent as a legal basis of processing, but again, we're coming into a conflict of law situation that absolutely has to be addressed. Otherwise, it's just introducing more confusion. And also many of the terms is not consistent with the other acts. They talk about a data user, but they also talk about a data user in the Data Governance Act, two separate definitions. In the GDPR, we talk about further processing. Here, they talk about the secondary use of data. Two different concepts, which may or may not be similar, we're not really sure. So how are you going to try and navigate the space, whereas someone with a legal background and 15 years of experience really doesn't know? How are you as a scientist going to know that? And some final considerations of the problems I see and kind of more ethical considerations. We are creating a legal obligation to share data that may be against the informed consent. Our biobank in CRIS is built up under like a particular consent, and we have told our participants we are going to only use your data in line with what we have told you. But now the European Health Data Space is saying, no, you can share it for all of these other purposes. And so we have built up a trusted ecosystem in CRIS. And what is this going to do to our trust that we have with our participants? We also see in other contexts, there's numerous examples of data being used against what people thought, and there's been huge pushbacks on that. A massive issue is that under the GDPR, we have a provision that you can be derogated or exempt from the right to information in further processing in the context of research. So if we are going to reuse your data for research, we may not have to actually tell you about that. The European Health Data Space is extending it to all of those 8 purposes. So it's gone from just 1 to 8 grounds in which we're actually not going to be telling participants. We're not actually going to be transparent in how the data is used. The joint opinion from the European Health Data Protection Board and Supervisor has questions why you're actually going to do that and why that is needed. And we're talking about transparency and accountability, but now we're just saying, oh, well, we know what we're doing, so, we're not going to tell you. Now, in the draft opinion from the European Parliament, they have said, no, we need an opt-out. So they have said we absolutely need participants to allow them to be opt-out. So this is important because if we don't have the right to information, we may still have all other rights under the GDPR, but you cannot exercise your rights if you don't know what your data is being used for. So the right to information is crucial in all of that. If they're going to get rid of it, essentially we don't really in practice de facto can exercise our other rights. I think it's important, and this is something Deborah flagged up, is that the use of data to train AI is not accepted by many. So we need to have a mechanism in place that allow people to express choice on whether or not we want to do it while we grapple with the social and ethical implications of AI. Rather than just saying, we're going to use it, it's better to say, we'll give it up to you. And at the beginning, build it into the system so that you can have this dynamic choice and preference expression. And the final concern I massively have, particularly from context of CRIS, is that CRIS has, and we're not the only biobank who has a trusted governance process in place. We've told our participants how we're going to govern it, how we're going to give access. We have been told the Research Ethics Committee how we're going to govern and how we're going to access. But the Health Data Access Board is going to go away with that and actually replace that. So they're now making the choice in how we use data and how we get access. So some concluding thoughts I think, well, first of all, overall, it is a top-down approach to governance, which has no count for the for us in as it currently stands. And the focus is very much anonymization as a method to protect participants. But we know that legal legitimacy alone for data sharing is never enough. It is one bit, but we need to have care.data as an example. In Ireland, we've had like massive problems on like kind of how we made our genomic data available, and it's just all over the world, legally permissible, socially unaccepted. This personal and non-personal distinction is not clear at all. The European Health Data Board, Health Protection Supervisor and Board has said that we need to just get over the fact it's not clear, and we need to stop pretending ourselves that personal data controlled, non-personal data, you know, happy, go away with you. We need to start having this conversation about the lack of distinction. It's not that clear, and what are we going to do? How are we going to governance in this space? The governance needs to be much more dynamic. In Europe, we are at a juncture when we are going to revolutionize how we share data. And I think it's time that we do. You know, we do have to allow the benefits of data to be accessed. But they're very much kind of doing it the easy way and just getting the data out. And it really speaks to kind of the power that's behind decision making, you know, who actually is making the decisions of what we're going to make it available for, rather than trying to have a dynamic process that allows us to change preferences over time as technologies change, because we're having the discussion of AI concerns, ethics, is that our concerns are going to change as we know more about the technology. So we should have a process and a dynamic infrastructure that is actually going to account for those. And after all, we're introducing electronic health records, apparently. Why not we're developing platforms, so why not embed, you know, these changes in how we're actually also going to have a secondary use of data. And finally, I'm going to leave, you know, the point that I kind of start with, it's just not addressing the problems, the difficult problems. It's given data sharing, but it's focusing on data protection, but it's not focusing on other concerns. What are societal expectations? What is benefit? Are all of these secondaries of data truly going to achieve a benefit? And for whose benefit are we actually talking about? And I will conclude there.
Hey, thank you so much. Fascinating development there, and I think useful considerations for this region as well. We are, before the break, going to hear a continuing discussion from Dr. Colin Mitchell. We heard from Colin yesterday, but the PhD Foundation at the University of Cambridge has done some very important work looking into the implications of the GDPR on data sharing, of course, as interpreted from the UK's standpoint. So I thought that it would be interesting to continue the discussion, what Chiara has very helpfully highlighted, particularly in terms of data transfer. Colin is going to be extremely industrious because he's giving us quite a few different presentations, but we do hope to take this opportunity to showcase the excellent work of a close partner of our center, which is, of course, PhD Foundation at Cambridge. Over to you, Colin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Calvin, and apologies if you're getting slightly fed up of me and my slide format, but I hope this provides a kind of complementary presentation to the foregoing presentations from expert colleagues. What I'm doing here is taking a bit of a zoom in to some of those issues that have been trailed by everyone this morning in relation to the specific rules that govern the processing of personal data in the EU, and I'll also mention the UK position now that the UK falls outside of the EU, and how that impacts global research collaborations, and in particular global genomic data sharing. So the first part of this, I think, relates to a whole host of the topics that have already been mentioned around some of the challenges for groups of people and researchers to come together and understand how the law operates and how they best negotiate the law in this area. Then there are some very specific challenges that relate to the rules set out in Chapter 5 of the GDPR, governing international transfers of data outside of the EU or European Economic Area. These are really complex issues, as you'll hear shortly, you know, and I'm sure many of you are very aware. They aren't easy to negotiate. but I will also think about the current state of play and raise some potential mitigations or solutions that have been proposed so far. And as Calvin kindly said, this is on the basis of our work at the PHG Foundation, actually funded by our own data protection authority in the UK, the Information Commissioner's Office, which I think was the first of its kind piece of research in Europe investigating the impact of the then fairly new GDPR on both genomic healthcare and research. And I'm just putting this up here really for reference because there is, you know, a wealth of detail, which is, I think, very significantly still up to date, contained in this report, and a more kind of accessible executive summary as well, covering a lot of this information. And the only other point in terms of introduction I think I'll make is that while this is a focus here on genomic data, I think so many of the aspects here and mentioned this morning relate to the sorts of sophisticated data processing that we're contemplating using AI technologies. And so I'm thinking in particular about high dimensional data processing, the ability to draw increasingly sophisticated inferences from otherwise seemingly innocuous data, connect those to individuals. So I think in terms of the kind of complexity and specific natures of AI processing's potential and genomic data, there are significant parallels. Okay, so we've already heard, and I'm sure many of you, and I know some of you are deeply expert in this topic, so I won't dwell on the nature of the EU General Data Protection Regulation, except to say that, you know, as Chiara mentioned, the aims of the GDPR are twin aims, really. One is to enable the free flow of personal data throughout the European Union, but the other is to strengthen and improve data protection across the Union on the basis of the fundamental right to data protection, which is recognised in the European Charter. The other, I think, crucial element, which again pertains to everything we've spoken about so far, is that this is a sector agnostic regulation in many ways. So the same general principles and rules apply across sectors, regardless whether this is in the context of healthcare or digital marketing, with the caveat that there are those specific areas which apply to, for example, research processing. And the headline, you know, aspects really as the GDPR was introduced were those really increased accountability and governance requirements. So the potential for fines of up to 4% of global annual turnover. And that combined with, I think, significantly enhanced rights and obligations really caught the attention of the research community. And I'm afraid I do want to mention slightly the UK position because we're now outside of the European Union since our own research. So I think the only thing I want to point out for now is that the UK provides a very unusual example of a country whose laws are virtually aligned with the EU at present. We have a version called the UK GDPR, but we are in a position where I think it's a perfect test case for alignment between EU or EEA countries and the rest of the world, as every incremental change or new interpretation made by data authorities in the UK threatens the relationship between the UK and the EU, and in particular the adequacy agreement that's in place between the two entities. So as we'll see further down through the presentation, I think there are aspects where the UK's proposed approach, the approach the government in the UK might take to adopt more research favourable innovation, favourable measures, really threatens potentially the adequacy arrangement in place. So I just going to very quickly provide a basic outline of the regulation and some of those key features in relation to genomic research. So firstly, the GDPR applies to all processing, which includes almost anything that can be done with data, including storage of personal data. And personal data is that crucial regulatory object here. So it refers to information that can be related to an identifiable individual. And I think has been alluded to already, this is potentially a very, very broad category of data. The standards that have been set through court judgments and interpretations by authorities for identifiability and conversely then for anonymization have been very high standards. So in the context of genomic data, we have the indication from the European Data Protection Board that almost all human genomic data should be considered inherently identifying. And I think, again, of relevance to AI processing, the ability to draw very disparate sources of data together to potentially link those to an individual on the basis of a kind of reasonable likelihood could include a very, very wide range of data. I think from the point of view of this presentation, I was seeking to talk about international research, international collaboration. So one of the crucial elements to the GDPR is its territorial scope. The GDPR doesn't just apply to processing of personal data within Europe. There are ways that it applies outside of Europe. And this is because it's based on the principle of the fundamental and universal right to data protection. So the first is that the GDPR will apply to processing anywhere in the world, for example, to a research project in Asia, if the processing is taking place in the context of the activities of a controller or a processor established in the Union. And what this means in practicality and through the guidance of the EDPB, the suggestion is that there must simply be a sufficient link with an EU research entity. For example, if research is being directed by an EU partner, or if some parts of a research project are being directed by them. So there just needs to be some potential link with meaningful exercise of control. And the second limb of the territorial scope applies to the offering of goods or services to anyone in the EU, or the monitoring of behavior. And I think this is again relevant to sort of the world of genomic or health research. For example, if people are being monitored through an app, if they are part of an ex-EU biobank, then this may well capture that. Or if a service, for example, a direct-to-consumer genomic service is marketed to someone within the EU. So once captured by the GDPR, there are a range of rights, principles, and requirements that apply. We've heard a little about the principles of data protection and how they are quite coherent with, I think, measures in place in other countries around the world. They're set out in the GDPR in Article 5, and there are a range of rights and responsibilities and obligations that follow. Crucial is that processing requires a lawful basis for the processing. Consent is only one of those lawful bases, but again, with the caveat of more specific national member state laws, which may require consent for specific forms of health data processing or research processing. And then we've just heard about sensitive data. Well, the GDPR actually refers to specific category data instead of sensitive data, which includes health data and genetic data too. And a further additional requirement is that a condition must be present to process that data. One of those includes the ability to process for research purposes, providing there are safeguards in place. And again, that's an area where you have significant variation across the member states about the safeguards that apply, and also the rights that may be derogated when processing for research purposes in different states. So there's still very significant scope for variation in the law between different EU or EEA countries. So I think this gives rise to a significant number of general challenges for international research collaborations. The first is that a sort of perhaps a slightly old-fashioned paradigm of presuming that you can work together using anonymized data is, I think, increasingly difficult based on the interpretations of personal data. And of course, with genetic and genomic data, we know that they are highly identifying. And they are also special category data requiring further special protection. Individual level health data or phenotypic data is very likely within the scope of personal data, even if pseudonymized, and it's pseudonymization and the position of data which have been coded and a key separated from the code that has caused a lot of confusion and difficulty for researchers many of whom in the past, depending where they're based, have considered pseudonymized data to fall outside the scope of personal data. Now it's clear it's very much within the scope of the GDPR. Although I will note that in the UK, you may potentially see a different standard being brought forward based on the interpretation of the Information Commissioner's Office and the intentions of the government at present. And the major challenges we find in our research for genomic research, it relates to really the complexity, uncertainty and ambiguity involved in interpreting the GDPR and applying it to the specifics of a research collaboration. These are many and various, but there are a number which include understanding the roles and responsibilities of the different parties. So who acts as a controller on the basis that they are in some way determining the means and purposes of processing. For some, it may still be feasible that they would consider genomic data non-personal, but in most cases, it's likely that genomic data are going to be personal data. And then there are a huge range of complexities in understanding how you apply, agree and apply things like legal bases and data subject rights. And then furthermore, how you apply safeguards and agreeing what safeguards are appropriate in international collaborations is very difficult because it requires accounting for different member states or national level safeguards. So we've seen a lot in the literature and in the press about the frustrations of researchers, in particular in the genomic field. And there are just a few notable examples here, including some quite high profile features from the NIH in the United States about the extreme difficulty they have had sharing data and maintaining data flows under the GDPR. And I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. So the second and sort of more obvious way in which the GDPR impacts international collaborations and international data sharing is under Chapter 5 of the regulation. And this sets a specific range of requirements for transfer of personal data to third countries, which are in addition to all the other requirements of the GDPR. What it requires is that another specific legal mechanism is in place to legitimate the transfer. And just noting here that when I'm talking about transfer, it isn't, a physical act of sending anything. It may include making data accessible. So facilitating remote access of data outside the EU is still within the scope of a transfer. So there are a range of legal mechanisms that might legitimate a transfer. And these run very much through a hierarchy in Chapter 5. First, as we've heard in relation to the UK as well in particular, there may be an assessment from the European Commission that a whole jurisdiction or a subsector of a jurisdiction offers essentially equivalent protection to that found in the EU for personal data, and therefore it's an adequacy decision is made which allows all transfers then to take place. That's only in place for 14 jurisdictions or sectors at present. So that really isn't helping a huge amount to everyone based elsewhere in the world. So then working down the hierarchy, you come to the potential for appropriate safeguards. For example, the use of standard data protection contract clauses between parties, or binding corporate rules amongst corporate entities to facilitate the transfer. If you can't make one of these safeguards work, there are some derogations. So a specific consent from the data subject for the international transfer is possible. It may be that you can justify the transfer on the basis of public interest or even vital interests if someone's life is at issue. Those are potentially feasible. And then there is a last point, which is if there is no alternative and if transfers are not to take place on a large scale, it may be that you can justify this on the basis of a compelling legitimate interest. But there are significant difficulties with all these mechanisms. So as I said about adequacy, that's only in place for a number of jurisdictions and sectors. That's not really helping many. And also in terms of some countries, it only applies to the commercial sector, which doesn't help public institution researchers, for example. Then not all the derogations may be feasible either. One notable challenge in the issue between the NIH and European collaborators relates to conflicts of law again. So it might be that domestic legal arrangements preclude a public body in, for example, the United States from agreeing to the contract clauses, in particular clauses on remuneration and legal redress under their own law, their own establishing law. There are other safeguards that are available, like codes of conduct, and we heard a lot about these sort of potential self-regulatory kind of mechanisms yesterday, the potential for codes or certification to sort of assist in a soft law way, where here it is baked into the GDPR as a way of potentially legitimating something. But this is untested and a really quite difficult process. You have to demonstrate significant kind of sectoral support and really work to obtain approval for a code of conduct, which will have to be pan-EU and approved by central bodies. And for certification, which may be useful, for example, for very specific forms of processing, but again, is not very easy to establish. And these are both untested mechanisms. Then the derogations, so for example, explicit consent, are very much interpreted as an exception to the general rule. So in this case, it's unlikely that derogations would legitimate kind of ongoing, steady sharing of data as part of a research collaboration. And then we have a kind of more overarching challenge on one hand, but also, as Chiara says, potentially very significant aspect of the European Union's inspiring approach to personal data around the world. And that's the threshold it sets for enabling international transfers outside of the EU. This is governed by Article 44, which sets a general principle that all transfers should only take place where the level of protection is essentially equivalent to that within the EU. And we know from the fairly recent Schrems II judgment, which concerned transfer of Facebook data to the United States, that this is a really high standard. And it doesn't just apply to assessment as part of an adequacy decision, but it applies to all the other transfer mechanisms too. What it requires is a case-by-case assessment of the legal framework of the third country by a controller, seeking to establish that there's a high level of fundamental rights protection in the recipient country, which are available to EU data subjects as well as third country residents. So that's a particular challenge, for example, in the United States, where the rights of non-citizens is not as clearly established. And there have to be really effective and enforceable administrative and judicial redress measures in place for data subjects to enforce those fundamental rights. So it's a really, really high standard established by the Court of Justice. The practical consequences of that kind of position and that ruling, one is that the EU-US Privacy Shield was invalidated. There were a lack of proportionality in those rules and safeguards for EU data subjects. In particular in relation to the ability of US national security agencies to access data. But the ruling also considered the ability for data controllers to use supplementary measures, kind of euphemistically, to safeguard some transfers and essentially slightly remedy the situation. There has been further guidance issued on supplementary measures by the European Data Protection Board. They include things like pseudonymization, encryption, etc. Frankly, they include a whole range of measures that are very likely in place for, say, a genomic research collaboration already. And it still remains an open query for data controllers whether their application of those things will be sufficient to protect a data transfer in context. It's still open and unknown and subject to interpretation. And the other consequence is that a very high standard is now being set, which includes the need for a data controller to conduct a kind of mini adequacy assessment in light of the fundamental rights of the European Union. So by no means an easy thing at all. And in terms of where we are now practically, yeah, there is ongoing agreement in terms of those US transfers between the EU and US, which is kind of starting a process again, whereby the European Commission agrees with the United States to make some incremental improvements. But again, this is very likely to be challenged in the European courts. So we'll see if that really works. As I said, there are those supplementary measures which might work, but they might not be sufficient in all circumstances, and risk remains with the controller. And where risk remains, controllers may be very risk averse. We saw during the pandemic that there was kind of some scope, as Deborah said, for an exceptional approach for COVID-19 purposes. And you could see that based on, important purposes in the public interest, those sorts of considerations. But as Deborah rightly said, that isn't the case with business as usual, ongoing long-term kind of collaborations, at least not within the interpretations and likely approach of the European courts. And also, in light of that Schrem's judgment and the latest kind of position from the Court of Justice, scholars are casting doubt on some of those existing adequacy arrangements, whether that, the practical reality here is whether someone brings a claim which will be assessed by the Court of Justice. But it's potentially the case that, well, scholars have written about Canada, but I could certainly say in the case of the United Kingdom, you could level a good number of the same criticisms at the domestic legal framework in a number of countries, as has been leveled at the United States. I think another practical kind of consequence then is whether there are computational solutions which may be feasible here, which will limit or completely avoid the disclosure of identifiable information. One topic I guess we haven't touched on today, but I think in terms of future-proofing how we address consent and relationships with data subjects and participants at the outset, is the potential generation of synthetic data. And that's being talked about very significantly as a strong potential in the next decade for powering the development of a whole host of AI tools. So I think there are real queries we should probably start thinking about now in terms of generating synthetic data on the basis of personal data. What are the rules that should apply? How should that be approached? And within kind of a thick view of data protection law, what's fair for data subjects? Just a thought. There are, as you might expect from a research community and more widely, a whole host of calls for solutions. The degree to which these have traction is not clear. So some include trying to negotiate standard contract clauses specifically for research purposes, which would kind of nod to those sector-specific practices and safeguards that are often in place. They might provide some scope for public bodies to enter into contract without having to agree some of those more challenging aspects of contracts. There are also strong calls for changes in guidance for public interest or the addition of an express public interest mechanism for transfers as part of scientific research, or to add more weight to investigating alternative methods, for example, a code of conduct for sharing of genomic or research data for health purposes. As I said earlier, though, there have been efforts, and they may be still ongoing in the EU, to try and develop these codes of conduct, and it's not an easy or a quick process. And then a real kind of nuclear option, but being strongly proposed at a sort of national level, is for some form of health research specific international transfer agreement. Again, that's clearly not an easy or a quick process. So I hope I haven't sounded too negative here. I think Chiara very rightly raised the point earlier of the kind of European Union's strengths in terms of how it's setting a standard for protection of personal data. And, there has been some talk of the Brussels effect in terms of inspiring other jurisdictions around the world to provide greater attention to the need to protect personal data. But there are key challenges for the international data sharing of genomic data for research purposes. And, very heavily, they still relate to significant uncertainty and complexity in just evaluating how the GDPR applies if personal data are involved. There is therefore, I think, the possibility that these will tend towards greater data localization. So kind of running counter to those norms and values that we've been hearing about earlier, and potentially more limited forms of analysis. There is some prospect for kind of bespoke or sector-specific approaches that might mitigate some of those challenges that apply to international transfers in the longer term. And I think it's fair to say that, well, if a Brussels effect, if that inspiring effect does really take place, then there's the potential that a level of global regulatory convergence could address some of these challenges, and essentially, you know, more jurisdictions will have kind of equalized rules. So I think that's it. I mean, that's a focus really on the genomic data situation, as I say, but I think what I'd like to emphasize is that most of these aspects are going to be challenges for processing and data sharing for the generation of AI tools, regardless whether you're dealing with highly special and sensitive genomic data or not. And as I say, further details available in our very comprehensive report, or you could read the executive summary. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mitchell. This is certainly very informative, and I encourage everyone who has not seen the report to have a look. With this, we have the first question from Cheng.
Yeah, thank you so much, Colin, for the great talk. I remember last September, it seems like in the UK government want to expand the scientific exception to include the academic researchers' separate legal basis for further processing data, and that proposal was actually be denied by the National Data Guardian. So I'm not quite sure about what's going on now. And also, as you mentioned, synthetic data, I was just wondering to what extent the synthetic data can solve the issue about the identification of genomic data, because there are lots of discussion about whether genomic data can really be de-identified or be completely anonymized. Even so, it turns to be synthetic data. I think the core issue still remains there. So I just two questions. I'll be happy to hear your thoughts.
Thanks, Cheng. Yeah, I mean, first on the UK position, you're right. What we've had in the UK have been kind of two bills brought forward. A first one, the UK is taking the opportunity, I think it's fair to say, now it's outside the European Union, of bringing forward what are very research pro-innovation rules in a lot of its strategies and policies. This is the UK government at present. So part of that did filter through to proposals in a data protection bill. And as you say, that included a number of measures which, I mean, to an extent, they are clarifying, I think, existing interpretations. So as you say, further processing for research purposes, which is potentially acceptable under the GDPR, but there is a query about whether you need a further legal basis for that or not, whether those two are standalone principles in the GDPR or not. And the UK government was very much trying to ensure that further processing for research purposes would be both legitimate and wouldn't require a new legal basis. And yeah, you're right, it's critiqued, but that's still there in the latest proposals. So we'll see how those get on as they go through Parliament. And the second part, sorry. Oh, synthetic data. Yeah, how can I forget? I spent the last month working on a report on synthetic data, which is why I mentioned it. So I think you're right. The extent to which, I think there are so many questions about the generation of synthetic data. So I think one is, what are the privacy implications? You know, is there a processing method by which you are essentially recreating, but with minor nuance differences, an analog, you know, a digital twin of a person in some form or another, a kind of comparison genome? To what extent should that still be viewed as private personal data? And to what extent that gives rise to new harms, you know, the potential for sidestepping of the existing regulatory or governance arrangements? I think there's a lot to be worked through before that could potentially solve some of those issues. But I also think there are much bigger picture questions as well. So the extent to which generation of synthetic genomes might subvert the principles of genomic sovereignty and the kind of attempts to enable different communities to have some sort of sovereignty in relation to their genomic data. Those are the big picture issues that I think will need to be worked through, regardless how quickly the sort of technical methods are advancing. Yeah, watch this space for a report from us, is what I'm saying. Thank you.
Fascinating. Well, thank you so much, Colin and Chixing, for the question. Any other questions for Colin? Well, please go ahead.
I suppose it's kind of a question and a comment. So we have the codes of conduct, which is untested, but in reality, how feasible is that? You know, EBMRI have tried to do code of conduct, which has gone nowhere. And when we're talking about, you know, quite a number of member states that we'd have to get agreement on. And again, I go back to the example of South Africa. A number of years back, when Panacea was being introduced, we had a meeting in Cape Town in which we called for code of conduct for research because of all of the issues in applying a generic data protection regulation to research. Now, we started that process for developing. The Academy of Sciences of South Africa took up our call and agreed to take on the initiative of developing a code of conduct for research. Now, I remember us having that conversation about developing the bodies back in, I think it was March, or it was sometime early days of the pandemic. Only last week did they submit the code for approval for the information regulation. And they went through a huge process of engagement, obviously hampered by the pandemic, but, you know, they got there. That's one jurisdiction, and it took 2.5 years to get to that point. And so while codes are needed, and we are always hearing time and time again that we need sector specific guidance, I'm just wondering what you think in reality, how likely is that to happen in the European context when we can't even get agreement on basic things?
Thanks, Kara. I completely agree. I think, you know, it's held out as a hope, but I think we've seen from the examples you mentioned, so the attempts are already underway in Europe to agree some principles and code basics in order to make progress towards a code, how slow and how difficult that has been. I guess the only thing I would say slightly counter that point is if it really is the case that almost no other method is going to progress here, perhaps that may, as a very long process involving a potentially narrower group of stakeholders who share a lot more in terms of values and understandings of kind of forms of data processing, maybe that has more legs than some of the alternative methods. I slightly wonder whether, and again, this would be really hard, but whether actually certification might be a better mechanism for some clearly prescribed forms of data processing. So I'm thinking of specific forms of processing within what, you know, secure, trusted research environments, for example, which I think certification is slightly better suited to. It sets a kind of model for, you know, adherence to technical standards and compliance and testing for those sorts of things. Perhaps there's an option there, but yeah, I completely agree. I don't know how realistic they really are.
Thank you so much. Any additional questions for Colin? So I just wonder, before we have a short break, right? So Colin, what is your prognosis of data sharing on a large scale, seeing all of these developments? Because it seems to be that looking at developments, both in terms of law and regulatory policy, a clear shift towards data localization, which may not be a bad thing if we think about it from an equity standpoint. So that there seems to be a greater emphasis on considerations of benefit. And I think that is going to be very important for affected communities, what ultimately should be the value proposition on the part of the research community to you know, affected others. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you're right, Calvin. I think the likely direction is towards greater localization, partly inspired by the, you know, the challenges I've described, partly because as laws are emerging around the world elsewhere, and kind of governments are beginning to consider the value and nature of the health data or genomic data in their jurisdictions, similar measures are kind of being put in place. I think this is likely to be the case, but I think the practical reality of where we are is still that I'm sure that a range of data sharing and transfers are taking place with what might be considered personal data due to, interpretations of anonymization or identification that maybe are not in line with what I've described. So I think there's a bit of a distinction between the kind of slightly pessimistic or cautious kind of nature of the principled approach to data sharing that I've outlined, and some of the reality, which I'm sure is a lot of practice that's taking place without potentially regulatory scrutiny at the moment. Yeah, as I sort of say, I don't know if there are incredibly powerful solutions, but there is also, I think, always the prospect of technological development. And what we've seen over time is a fairly dual kind of arms race, I call it, between identification methods and de-identification methods. I don't know, query to what extent some of the technologies we've considered in, today and yesterday might provide a bit of a leap forward in terms of protecting and de-identifying and anonymizing data too. So perhaps there is a technical option in the future, but I don't know.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Colin. Everyone, if you could join me again and thank you, Colin, for the excellent presentation. Thank you. It's very informative. So we're going to have a short break now. Sorry, it's going to be 5 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. We are going to get started again. As we've given the presenters flexibility in presenting either in the English language or in Mandarin. If you feel you need a translator, please feel free to get a headset. The headset will enable you to listen to the presentation in English, for instance, if the presentation is in Mandarin or vice versa. So thank you very much in advance. So with this, we are now going to return the focus to this part of the world, and I am sorry, if I may just trouble everyone to just return to your seats for the time being. Thank you. I'm delighted to introduce the next speaker, Professor Stephen Tu, who is, of course, very close to Hong Kong, from Macau, the University of Macau, just across from us. And as you see, Professor Tu has got this unique combination of medical training and law training. So he brings both perspective and the synthesis across these two important disciplines. So with this, Professor Tu, it's over to you. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you, Calvin, for having me here and also holding this wonderful discussion on this great topic. Also, for this presentation, I was asked by Calvin to give the talk on the regulation of genetic testing based on my previous research projects. So I just explored a little bit to cover the use of AI in the genetic testing to make it more feed into our today's discussion. So in today's talk, I'm going to explore the use of AI in genetic testing, focusing on the Chinese regulatory framework and explore some legal issues that we can further discuss in our next session. To start with, in recent years, as all of you can tell, that the cost for genetic sequencing decreased dramatically. However, the interpretation of genetic sequencing results still very human demanding and also request a high level of expertise, special expertise in interpret the variants and produce the report. So this is why and how the AI has been planned to incorporate it into this type of services. And here I got the news, which is published on the official website of Huawei, indicating the BGI's genetic testing services. Just give a very brief translation. It says that by the end of 2017, BGI had served nearly 5 million people in clinical testing of fertility products and completed more than 2.8 million non-invasive prenatal genetic testing. This is the data from 2017, and I can still recall at the time that the cost for an NIPT in North America could be around $2,000 to $3,000 but in Shenzhen, where the BGI located, the cost would be around 800 RMB. It's a $150 after subsidies from the Shenzhen's local governments. And then a couple of months later, it reduced to 400 RMB, and now is totally free to get this test. Based on the data here, we've already seen there's a good foundation for develop AI into genetic testing services. So here, this is what kind of routine that you applying AI in medical treatments and research usually goes. On the one hand, we need to feed the algorithms with the data, so genetic data and health records and other health-related records like lifestyle records, and also prior knowledge of genetic variants. And using the AI algorithms, different types like supervised learning, unsupervised learning, and reinforcement learning algorithms, that these type of software can, first of all, generate an automated interpretation of variants. The capability is larger and more capable than expertise in some ways, and faster for sure. And also can identify coding and non-coding genetic variants. And if combined with the health records, that it can produce clinical genetic diagnosis. When we develop the AIs and use it in genetic testing services, so several laws are relevant in China that can impact the development of AI in genetic testing. So here I listed several applicable laws. Above the yellow lines are the direct related to the regulation of the use of human genetic data. Haihong is going to cover medical research and focusing on personal information protection law and other related regulations. So I will leave it to her for that part. I'm going to talk mainly about the human genetic data. So here we have personal information protection law of the PRC and also the data security law of the PRC. These two laws are recently established, and it could be especially the PIPL, the personal information protection law, is being regarded as the first personal information protection legislation in China. So this law regulate how to protect the personal information. And the data security law focusing more on the security perspective, personal data and the data. And there are other relevant regulations like the measures for the security assessment of outbound data transfer established in 2022. And the regulation on the administration of human genetic resources. So this is very focused and special regulations that governs the administration of human genetic data and also the transfer of human genetic data. And the national health and the medical big data standards, security and service management measures also recently a couple of years ago issued to manage the standard security and service management perspective of health and medical big data. So they are they're directly related to the management of human genetic data. And there are other types of regulations and laws that are relevant to this topic, including the cybersecurity law of PRC, civil code of the PRC, which was promulgated in 2020. And this also the milestone for the civil law in China. So these laws also give the legal grounds for protecting natural persons' privacy, and also the guiding principles for registration review of artificial intelligence medical devices. Calvin just mentioned yesterday. So this one refers to the registration of the AI medical devices, and this is also relates to the development of AI application in genetic testing services. So I go into some detail. So when we're talking about human genetic data, if it is identifiable, of course, it will locate it into the scope of personal information protection law. According to Article 4, it says the personal information means all kinds of information related to identified or identifiable natural persons. And here it excludes information that has been anonymized. Therefore, if the genetic testing companies holding their human genetic data from the consumers, if this data is de-identified, then probably that PIPL will not apply to this type of data. However, even exceptions for the application of PIPL, such kind of data still be regulated under other laws. So the first one is data security law. According to Article 3, data means any records of information in electronic or any other forms. And here that in this law, it also proposed the definition of important data. So important data means those data that are related to the national security and public health and security. This is defined in the later regulation entitled Measures for the Security Assessment of Outbound Data Transfers. So if the data has been deemed as important data, according to the data security law, the National Data Security Work Coordination Mechanism shall establish measures to strengthen the protection of important data. And next is the regulation on the administration of human genetic resources. So this regulation was amended in 2009. And according to this regulation, human genetic resources cover two types. So the first type is materials of human genetic resources. This is more like, biosamples, organs, tissues, and cells that contain human genomes, genes, and other genetic substances. And the other type is information on human genetic resources. So obviously that the data from genetic testing would be located in this category. Here it is very special and also influential regulation and provisions within this regulation is that according to Article 7, foreign organizations and individuals and institutions formed or actually controlled by the foreign entities shall not collect or preserve China's human genetic resources within the territory of China, and shall not provide China's human genetic resources abroad, which means that as foreign entities is not allowed to obtain, to access, and also without permission cannot transfer the Chinese human genetic resources, the data outside China to another foreign entities. And also an important article is Article 10, the trading in human genetic resources shall be prohibited, which means even it's de-identified, the data set cannot be like sold or to sell and buy. And in 2018, according to this management measure, the health and the medical big data and also covers the human genetic data. And once it covered, that such kind of data shall be stored within the country. It cannot be stored in like the foreign jurisdictions. And according to Article 10, if it is necessary, really necessary to provide it overseas due to business needs, the security assessment review shall be conducted in accordance with relevant laws, regulations, and relevant requirements. So these measures covers to almost all entities, including administrative departments at the county level and above, and or other like the research institutes, medical health institutes, and units and individuals. So it's very likely that genetic testing companies should also be governed by this measure. So in terms of the development of AI in genetic testing, so there are two processing in kind of importance, and I cover two parts here, and Hai-Hong probably covers the other rest of the processing. So the first is access and sharing human genetic data. So if it is de-identified, which means that personal information protection law will be not governed, and relevant laws are actually not provided too many provisions on these certain activities. So human genetic data, in principle, shall be stored within China. This is what I explored in my previous slides. And the rest of the regulation, it goes to self-regulated. So based on our previous research, we investigate direct-to-consumer genetic testing services, their website, and explore how the companies are dealing with the consumer's right, consumer's data in terms of reuse, sharing, and selling their information. And our research found that 52 websites doesn't mention about the company's right to reuse, sharing, and sell clients' information. Within the 32 that mentioned, 28 companies states that, and the client's further permission, the company can reuse and share the client's information for non-commercial purposes. And there is one company even say they can reuse, share the client's information for non-commercial purposes without client's further permission. And also we found that the majority direct-to-consumer genetic testing companies didn't provide or mention what kind of rights for consumers to their data. And 26% mentioned yes. And here that the most mentioned rights and the right to decide whether the website can use their data for following up research or provide the data to third parties. And 9 companies mentioned consumers have right to view, change, and remove their own data from website. So here it means that the companies, first of all, very likely their data is identifiable. And if it is identifiable, that if they wanted to use this data to generate, to help to develop AIs, softwares, probably they need to ask further permissions from the consumers. And a cross-border genetic data transfer. So here, this is a very complicated situation. So my student and I just developed the chapters focusing on exploration on how to do this type of activities. And we found that such kind of activities in China are multi-layered. Different types of regimes govern the same thing. Based on the data is identified or de-identified, here that different types of reviews need to be carried out before such a kind of data can be transferred from mainland China to the foreign entities. These also, as the previous speakers just mentioned, such kind of cross-border transfer have two types of meanings. One is to transfer outside, the other is access to such kind of data. So several administrative agencies are responsible for assessing and overseeing such kind of transfer activities. If it is located under the human genetic data regulations, then the security review by the Ministry of Science and Technology will be carried out. If it is relocated as the personal information, then the data holder will first do the self-evaluation and then pass this request to the National Cyber Administration for carrying out the security assessment. And based on the result, then this data can be transferred from mainland China to another foreign entities. However, this is the channels that you can try, but it takes time. And also there are uncertainties about the procedures and the time that how long it may finish such kind of assessment and can be transferred. So some legal issues and challenges I observed based on this quick exploration. So first, the concern goes to the de-identification. If the data is de-identified, then the personal information protection law will not be applied. Therefore, in practice, data holders just claim that the data has been de-identified, but so far there has been no guidelines established for determining what is de-identified. So in this case, such kind of exceptions may be misused. And also because the human and genetic data cannot be trained. And also the new laws about the personal data information has been carried out, which means that if the hospital or genetic testing companies wanted to share the data, they may carry out a lot of process and they don't earn anything. So there's a lack of interest in sharing human genetic data and other health-related data. And foreign entities are difficult to access human genetic data. This is also raised a kind of issue that because of underrepresentation in the training data, the genetic risks prediction is likely to unequally performance in different population groups. And because the China's human genetic data can only be used within China, and AI-related products probably can only be applicable to the population in China. So these gives the kind of, I don't know, the future dilemma that, when people are doing the genetic testing using the AI-assisted software, that they can only predict the Chinese genetic risks, while the other foreign companies, they don't enter into this ground and they cannot provide such kind of services. So probably there are some issues there we can discuss later. And also there are uncertainties about the registration of AI medical devices, because according to the relevant regulation, first of all, these devices must be regarded as the medical devices. If it is not medical devices, then even you apply the AI, that you don't need to apply registration and AI medical devices. So for example, like BGI and Da'an, so these big genetic data sequencing companies, they provide a clinical diagnosis. Very likely they need to apply registration for their AI medical devices. But for those small companies, especially those DTC genetic testing companies, they don't generate the clinical genetic diagnosis. Probably they don't need to apply this kind of registration. And these may also trigger some chaos in this field, AI-assisted genetic testing industry. The last one, I think this is also not a new issue, but very likely occur in AI-assisted genetic testing services, that is AI. The use of AI may trigger group discrimination. So currently that our privacy be protected under the law, but the law is personal privacy protection law. But when it is like a group that has the same features like diabetes or other types of genetic disorders, then their privacy, the privacy cannot be protected under the current law, and these triggers the protection challenges. Right? So this is what I wanted to share with you today. I'm looking for discussions, and special thanks to my students, the team who helped me to explore and to generate these projects. Thanks again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Tu. Thank you. So as mentioned, we're going to hear all three presentations together, and then we'll invite the panel. We'll have a group discussion following this one. Of course, a very important starting point since there is a lot of complexity, given that when we think about data transfers, there may be three different legislations that would apply. It's Personal Information Protection Law, Data Security Law, and the Cyber Security Law. And of course, right now we're going to hear from Dr. Tung, who's going to further complexify the discussion, because we're going to bring in the ethical infrastructure. So that as we have heard from Professor Tuan yesterday, you see that there have been quite a number of new policies introduced and a very clear focus on ethics. So what do all of this mean? So Dr. Zhang Haihong has immense experience in human subject protection, particularly from the standpoint of a leading international research institution, that's Peking University, the Health Services Center, isn't it? Health Sciences, I'm sorry. Yeah, Health Science Center. And we are very privileged to have her share with us some of the very recent developments. And Dr. Zhang, you're welcome to introduce. Sure, why that's the echo. Okay, resolved now. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. And allow me to give my presentation in Chinese. So, and later I will join the discussion in English. 非常荣幸今天能够来到这个会议上。从昨天到现在呢，我们关于我们的医疗人工智能和数据的治理有很多的讨论，不管是从我们法律角度，还是我们相关的伦理问题。那么也非常感谢杜教授之前对我们国家，尤其是中国大陆地区，对于我们涉及这个医疗人工智能以及我们的基因相关数据的信息的法律法规框架的一个全面的介绍。那么非常荣幸，我作为一个专业的被训练为科研伦理审查的这样一个专业人员，能够参加到这样一个很有趣的国际化的讨论和对话当中。在今天我的报告当中呢，可能我主要会从两个非常重要的法律和政策文件当中。首先就是我们的个人信息保护法从21年生效以来，我们的基因相关的数据，我们的人类遗传资源相关的样本和数据，那么其实都在我们个人信息保护法的这样一个管辖范围之内。那么除了在法律层面的这样一个规定，在我们的实践层面，我们如何去确保我们严格遵循法律的相关规定，把这么多一系列的框架性的这样一个法规要求落实到我们的实践当中，不管是我们基于人类基因相关的研究，还是我们关于医疗人工智能的这样一个研发和应用过程当中，那么在这里我们最就是具体的真正操作落到实地的一个工作，就是在我们的伦理审查当中。那也随着我们整个就是伦理审查和科技伦理治理在我们国家顶层的制度设计层面和实践操作层面的这样一个快速的发展变化，其实在伦理审查的过程当中，也对我们开展这样一个基因相关的研究以及医疗人工智能的研发带来了特别多的这样一个挑战。那么除了我们看到我们国家整体的这样一个法律框架之外，我在这里的一个侧重的重点是伦理审查。那么在伦理审查，我们可以看到，不管是我们的药物临床注册实验，还是医疗器械的临床注册实验，我们都有我们中国版本的 GCP 进行了相关规定。那么在 GCP 当中，伦理审查是一个重要的要求，而具体伦理审查的规范 要落实到我们从2016年的原来的卫计委发布的涉及人的生物医学研究的伦理审查办法，以及今年4月份4个部委联合发布的这样一个涉及人的生命科学和医学研究的伦理审查办法。当然，作为这2个到目前为止并行有效的伦理审查办法，它的一个顶层设计是我们去年3月份由我们的中共中央办公厅、国务院办公厅联合发布的关于加强科技伦理治理的这样一个意见作为顶层的设计。好，那在这样一个法律和伦理审查的政策背景和最新进展的这样一个情况下，我们看一下我们的个人信息保护法对于这些个人数据、敏感个人信息，以及我们可能涉及国际合作和跨境传输的这样一些具体的规定。那么我们是从伦理审查的角度来切入，而且这些法规在我们的伦理审查的切入当中，我们最关注的一个热点，或者说大家把它真正落到实处的一个具体措施，那么就是我们的伦理审查委员会作为这样一个独立的审查的专业委员会，它怎么把一些个人信息保护基本的伦理原则和法律要求落实到审查实践当中。那我们可以看到，在个人信息保护法当中，对我们的个人信息进行了明确界定，对我们的个人信息处理做出了明确界定，但是对于我们在什么样的原则和条件下能够处理这些信息和数据，其实提出了5条非常明确的要求。包括我们要有合法正当的目的，那就意味着我们的任何的数据的使用、采集、保存，那么必须是在一个最小必要的原则下。那么在这个过程当中，我们的目的的合法性，整个实施和处理过程是否公开透明，我们所获取的数据，不管是在最初的采集、保存还是应用过程当中，它是否能够真正确保数据的客观、准确、完整。同时呢，我们所有的利益相关方，尤其是涉及到数据处理的责任主体，必须要保障这样一些数据的隐私安全和数据的保密性。那么同样，在满足这5个基本原则的要求之上呢，我们才可能谈到我们个人信息和数据的进一步处理和利用。那么除了相关的法律的特定条款规定之外呢，我们最重要的处理数据的一个基本前提，那就是个人的知情同意。那我们可以看到，在个人信息保护法的第17条和14条当中，明确的规定了，对于一般性的个人信息的话，我们必须要有事先的、明确的、具体的知情同意。那么谁将在什么时候收集什么样的数据，基于什么目的处理数据，这些信息必须在我们的知情同意书和知情同意过程当中充分告知。那么这些是对于我们一般化的个人信息处理的基本的知情同意要求。而第2个层面，我们会涉及到一些更加敏感的信息。如果说个人信息我们在判断它是否可识别的这个基础之上，那么即使是一些 de-identified 的个人数据，它可能也会具备一定的敏感性。所以是否可识别和这个数据是否本身具有敏感性，是我们在伦理过程当中考虑的非常重要的2个维度。那么考虑到这些敏感信息的话，在我们通用的个人信息的知情同意基础之上，我们对敏感信息处理的知情同意提出了更进一步的要求，那就是特定的目的，然后这样的处理敏感信息为什么重要，而且为什么必要。相应的，因为这些信息的敏感性，我们有哪些匹配的特殊的保护措施。那么除了在知情同意的告知信息当中有这些额外的要求的话，那么我们在知情同意的形式上也明确的提出了单独知情同意。 单独知情同意意味着我们在常规操作当中，一个简单的声明，您的信息可能用于将来，但是我们现在仍然不知道什么目的的这样一个研究的这样一个简单的声明，在这条法规的框架下已经是不可接受的了。那么同时我们也会看到，所有14岁以下的这样一个儿童的信息都属于个人敏感信息。那么要涉及这个14岁以下的儿童的这样一个知情同意的时候，必须要获得他的监护人的同意。那么对于这个儿童本身，根据我们的民法相关规定的话，8岁又是另外一个界限。8岁以上，我们可能不仅需要获得监护人的知情同意，还需要获得这个孩子本身的 assent。好，那这是我们关于个人信息和敏感个人信息的不同层面，或者说对知情同意的这样一个有区分的要求。那么第3块，在个人信息保护法当中，相关要求要落实到伦理审查过程当中，那就是我们关于数据的跨境传输和分享。那么除了我们在工信部相关部门的这样一个安全评估，以及就是我们有资质的相关机构的这样一个 certification 之外呢，我们还需要有明确的书面合同，把数据的提供方、接受方双方的责任进行明确。当然，如果涉及人类遗传资源信息的话，那么我们人类遗传资源保护条例的相关规定也同样适用。这是我们的个人信息保护法给我们就是提供的，在伦理审查过程当中，哪些信息、什么样的知情同意的要求、知情同意的内容和知情同意的形式的这样一些具体规定。那在这样一个个人信息保护的法律要求的框架之下，我们通过伦理审查的这样一个具体机制，把这样一个法规要求落实到我们的实践当中，尤其是涉及到基于研究目的处理这些数据的实践当中。好，那回过来，对于我们的这样一个伦理治理的话，2022年3月份，我们的两办发布了这样一个关于加强科技伦理治理的意见，它是一个 policy document， 严格意义上不是一个法律。但是呢，在目前为止，它是我们国家关于我们的伦理治理和伦理要求最重要的，也是最有效力的这样一个文件。在这个文件当中，其实主要提出了4个战略性的要求，或者说在未来的一段时间内，不管是我们的政府机构还是科研工作者，大家的工作重点都是要去落实这个文件提出的4个主要策略。首先，我们明确不同的责任主体，我们的国家科技伦理委员会，我们的省部级相关管理部门，我们的机构，以及我们作为个体的研究者，大家作为我们的责任主体应该做什么。那么第2个，我们要依法行事，不管是国家的政府，还是我们的机构，还是我们个体的这样一个科研工作人员，我们都要遵循法律法规和相关的操作标准。那么第3个最主要的工作，那就是我们提出了要加强科技伦理治理，但是我们的科技伦理治理最重要的策略措施或者说抓手是我们的伦理审查这样一个具体的工作。那么同样，除了伦理审查之外，我们也提出了全面的教育培训。而教育培训的话，4个层面，包括我们确保伦理审查委员具备相应的能力和资质，对于我们科研人员全过程的全面的伦理培训，以及对我们的学生将来的科研人员的伦理培训和公众的伦理培训。那么正是在这样一个科技伦理治理的框架下，我们的医学和生命科学领域的伦理审查，在今年的2月份，由4个部委，我们的卫健委、科技部、教育部、国家中药管理局联合发布了这个最新的伦理审查办法。 这是我们国家在过去30年对于我们医学领域的伦理审查这样一个发展历程以来，首次由不同部委联合发布我们的伦理审查规范。而在这个规范当中呢，我们可以看到，它的上一个版本是2016年版本。那么从2016到2023年版本有3个基本的要点，或者说基本的立场，那就是我们的机构，不管是医院、高校、科研院所，应该发挥这样一个主体责任，为设立伦理审查委员会、支撑伦理审查委员会独立开展工作提供支持。那么同样，知情同意和伦理审查是最重要的2个伦理监管策略。那么同样也要对标我们的世界医学会赫尔辛基宣言、贝尔蒙报告提出的尊重、有利、公正3大伦理原则，将这些原则落实到我们国家的这样一个伦理审查工作当中。那么我们可以看到，在2023版我们的最新的伦理审查的这样一个办法当中，我们要去遵循尊重、有利和公正这3个国际公认的伦理原则，但是这些原则是非常泛化的，我们需要把这些原则解读为我们可操作的标准和规范。那么在这个基础之上，我们的办法提出了6条伦理审查的基本要求。首先是要求我们一定要控制风险，控制风险要求我们要全面的识别风险，采取措施避免不必要的风险，而且在整个过程当中进行动态的风险监测。那么第2点，同样最复杂的也是最重要的问题之一，那就是我们的知情同意。第3点，公平公正，还有我们在整个的研究过程当中，除了受试者或数据主体的这样一个安全之外呢，其实相关的权利包括可能涉及的花费、研究相关伤害的赔偿以及相应的补偿等等。那么最重要的，随着我们个保法的这样一个发布和生效呢，我们的隐私保护和个人信息的安全已经明确的作为我们伦理审查的一个基本要求被提出来。当涉及脆弱人群或特殊人群的时候，我们还要有相应的特殊保护。那么这6个基本要求是我们在伦理审查过程当中必须要去逐一切可的这样一个审查的批准标准。那么再进一步的，在这些标准和规范的框架之下，我们可以看到伦理审查的申请材料，这个可能是更加细节和具体的这样一个行为规范和要求。我们可以看到在这里高亮了2条，其实是非常重要的。第1条是我们关于科研诚信的这样一个承诺，其实它更多的是需要加强我们的项目负责人，也就是我们 PI 的这样一个责任承诺。伦理审查的一个基本理念是相信并确诊，但是这样的话，我们收到的伦理审查材料本身的可靠性就非常重要。而第2点，我们会看到，如果涉及生物样本、数据和信息的话，我们要提供相关的来源证明。那么在这儿，我们需要把它解读一下。如果我的研究涉及前瞻性的收集样本或数据，我不需要这个证明，我只需要在我的实施方案当中明确的说清楚。那么同样，如果我使用的是既有的样本和数据，我就需要这样一个证明。这个证明可以是一个 certificate， 也可以是一个 contract。而这个证明它补充或者说扮演的2个角色，第一，要证明这些既有的样本数据来源本身是合法的。第2，要证明我们基于当下的这个研究目的，使用和处理这些样本数据是获得了相应的授权，或者合法或不符合相应伦理要求的。好，那除了这2点，那么我们可以看到别的内容其实都是我们在以前常规的内容当中已经是一个最佳实践的表现。好，那在这些材料的基础之上，我们的法规或者说伦理审查管理办法对于知情同意书内容的要求，其实也实际上增加了很多。 那么我在这里想特别突出的是增加了3点内容。首先，我们可以看到增加的3点内容当中，其中1条是关于数据。那么这点还有就是我们的第3点关于生物样本。所以为什么提出这2条的增补？其实我们想去鼓励我们的科研人员，鼓励我们的科研机构能够更加事先的、长远的、周全的考虑，在完成我们当下的研究目的之后，我们涉及的这样一些数据和样本稍后会怎么处理。如果仅用于本次研究，我们是销毁还是怎么处理，需要明确的告知。当然，如果需要保存下来，涉及将来可能的2次使用，我们要有一个重要的、合理的安排。那么同样在知情同意书当中，也需要事先的、充分的告知。而第3点，我们可以看到在中间明确的提到了我们的这个研究结果是否会反馈给受试者。那么这一点，我们从法规仔细的解读，不是要求必须反馈所有的研究结论，但是呢，我们需要提醒我们的研究者去考虑是否需要反馈。好，这是我们在知情同意书内容上新增的3个比较新的内容。那同样，在知情同意过程这里，我们整个的这样一个新版办法的修订，提出了再次知情同意的要求。那么再次知情同意的要求，我们是对接世界医学会国际医学伦理准则的这样一些国际标准。那么再次获取知情同意，让我们的知情同意过程成为真正的贯穿我们整个研究实施的这样一个全面的动态的知情同意过程。那如果在这个过程当中，研究的内容发生了重大变化，研究的风险实质的增加，还有就是我们的受试者的这样一个知情同意能力发生变化的话，那么根据我们现行的办法是需要获得再次知情同意的。好，那我们可以看到，正是基于我们的个人信息保护法对信息的相关规定，以及我们最新的2月份4个部委在伦理审查层面提出的新的要求。那么对于我们要从事相关的基因的研究，以及我们在医疗人工智能的这样一些研发工作当中，其实所有的这些新增的要求都是非常契合我们整个这样一些研究新型的范式和业态的这样一个最新进展。但是同时我们确实也是看到，尤其是在近几年，不管是我们的法律法规指南还是政策文件，都在快速的出台和发布。但是整个在这儿，我们如何能够确保我们开展特定类型的研究的时候，能够真正的做到合规的开展要求，以及按照相应的最新的办法去进行伦理审查、隐私保护和知情同意。这个我们相信对于我们所有人来说，尤其是在实践层面，可能都是最大的问题，或者说最大的挑战。好，那一个最实际的考虑，我们不管是什么层级的规范，它有这样一些要求提出来的时候，最重要的是我们能够让它得以实现。在我们真正的研究行为，在我们真正的伦理审查和相关的管理活动当中，去把这些要求落实下来。那么首先我们看到就是不同的利益相关方或者说责任主体都会深度的介入这个过程。大家首先要理解和明确自己的职责，然后再根据我们各个工作环节的这样一些操作规范去落实我们的职责。那么这个时候，一个最主要的问题，我们会看到我们动态变化的研究的需求，我们动态更新的法律政策法规的要求，对于我们所有各方的能力资质以及在实践过程当中真正去开展这些工作，其实都提出了非常大的挑战。好，那除了这些就是非常现实的，我们特别希望让所有的要求能够真正得以实现的这样一个现实考虑之外，在伦理审查这儿，可能不管是对于我们的医疗人工智能还是基因相关研究，即使是对于我们传统的 临床试验或者说临床研究来说，伦理审查的质量和效率其实一直是我们关注的核心主题。那么随着这些新型研究范式的出来的话，我们很经典的这样一些挑战，它的内涵和外延在不断的拓展。包括我们可以看到，如果说传统的药物临床试验的多中心研究容易面临的问题是不必要的重复审查的话，那么对于我们在医疗人工智能的研发当中，我们会涉及到企业、高校、科研院所和医院这些意志性的主体，在一个活动的不同环节参加到我们整个的研发和管理活动当中，我们如何去让它能够和谐的、统一的去聚焦伦理的系统管理，而不是出现一个碎片化的自己只管自己当下的环节。那么这个随着我们对不同主体要成立伦理审查委员会的要求，不同主体要加强科技伦理治理责任的要求一出来，可能是下一步在实践层面我们面临的最可能的大的挑战。大家怎么能够有一个 concerted efforts working together？ 但是这个时候我们需要一个 conductor， 但是这个 conductor 的角色现在由谁来扮演？我们目前暂时从实践的层面还没有非常的清楚。好，那除了这一点，还有就是我们的知情同意。那么我们在昨天和今天的报告当中，这是一个不断出现的经典的话题。但是在我们的个人信息保护法当中，略为遗憾的是，我们对于我们的科学研究没有这样一个个人信息保护政策的灵活性和自由裁量空间。那么这就意味着我们会看到，在今年2月份的伦理审查办法当中，我们已经没有了知情同意豁免的条款。那么这就意味着我们使用基因相关的数据，甚至长远的将来，我们的大数据和我们的医疗人工智能研发的时候，我们的知情同意可能会成为一个真正的卡脖子的问题。好，那除了这儿，我们从伦理审查之外，还需要有一个更广泛的视角。那么我们会看到，伦理审查是我们伦理治理的重要策略，或者说重要措施。但是伦理治理并不等于伦理审查。我们需要看到，伦理审查本身要有负责任的、高质量的、高效率的伦理审查。但是我们没有办法期待我们任何的这样一个伦理管理措施是一步到位，一下子就做得非常完美的。那么我们可能的一个有效的实践策略是如何能够一步一步的往前推进，而在这个过程当中，我们整个这样一些审查和治理需要接受我们持续的这样一个合规性的这样一个监测。那么如果发现问题，我们怎么样让识别问题、发现问题和质量改正成为一个真正的持续的过程，而不是说我们追求一个完美主义，寻找一个就是能够解决所有问题的这样一个完美方法。那么同时，正如我们在这2天其实讨论的很多的是法律的视角、伦理的视角，但是我们会提到的最后一点，那就是不管是我们的伦理要求还是法律要求，包括我们的伦理审查，更多的是一个 regulatory 的这样一个 review 的时候，我们希望让这些法律相关的政策规定成为我们的 flow， 而不是 ceiling。好，那到现在呢，我的报告到此结束，非常感谢，然后谢谢 Kevin。
Thank you so much, Dr. Tung, for this very informative presentation. Of course, as we see, it draws together all of these various considerations in practice. So there are a number of important practical challenges. We are not aiming for perfection at this stage, but we can think of how we could get to that particular position. But as I've mentioned, we're going to reserve Dr. Tung for later for the panel discussion. So do save your questions. Thank you again, Dr. Tung. So now I'm delighted to invite our final speaker for this particular segment of day 2, and that's Professor Chi-Sing Ho. Professor Ho is no stranger to HKU because she has been previously associated with the Center for Medical Ethics and Law and remains so our research fellow. So very delighted to welcome Professor Ho. So Professor Ho from Academia Sinica in Taipei, and very delighted to hear her thoughts on this very important topic, also relating to, of course, digitalization and digital health. Moving forward, what are some of the challenges that we need to consider? Thanks so much, Professor Ho.
Thank you so much, Calvin. It's really my great pleasure to be back to Hong Kong U. And now it's CML's 10th anniversary. I was the first research officer here back to 10 years ago. So happy to see we have Dr. Bei here and Anthony and thank you so much for Calvin for having me here. So I would like to share a little bit about my recent research. It's about the digital health, data governance, and legal framework. In Taiwan, actually, in recent years, we start large scale, national scale data collection and also the signal use of data initiative. And we try to integrate genomic and health data, especially for secondary purpose and light purposes, repurposing for AI application. So the first one was now is still going on. It's called the TPMI, Taiwan Precision Medicine Initiative. This spatial project is kind of like the All of Us project in the United States, and it's now carried out by Academia Sinica, my institute. And the purpose for that is that we want to recruit 1 million participants. 1 million participants, and to join this large cohort. And there's a little bit different from Biobank, because Biobank is we just collect data and for future research. And this one is that we try to do the genetic testing to specify who are the high risk population, especially for the common disease in Taiwan. And if we can specify this particular group and give their some health management advice right before they really encounter the disease, and we think that we can actually solve last cost for the health insurance. So for this particular project, we collect lots genetic information, and we need to establish a very robust and solid data governance framework in order to govern this genomic data. And actually, in practice, this project is Academia Sinica collaborate with 16 other hospitals in Taiwan, and we use the institutional review board. So we based on the specific consent. We didn't really go to the broad consent model like the Biobank. And now the Taiwan faced a new revision, a new amendment on our Biobank law. So the government want to expand the definition about the Biobank to include health data without samples in order to try to regulate this kind of large database. So perhaps in the future, soon, that this TPMI database will also be governed by the Biobank law in Taiwan. And why Taiwan government want to establish this is that we have a relative homogeneous genetic population. So we have 2% Taiwanese Aboriginal group and also 90% Han Chinese genetic background. And the other hand is that we have a quite comprehensive national health insurance database. So we try to use this database as a niche to promote it. The large health application. And the other large data integration project is called the National Biobank Consortium of Taiwan. This consortium is that we try to set up some common data model for the Biobank to share their data with each other. We didn't really try to centralize all the data together to create another huge Biobank. We don't want to do that, because now we understand if we centralize everything all together, we just increase the data controller's risk and responsibility. But for establishing this cohort, every hospital, they can be easier to share their electronic health data and also data in the biobanks. And also for this data integration efforts, we see some legal and ethical issues and consideration. The first one is just like we discussed yesterday and now today is that we need lots data, especially training data for AI application. So as much data as possible, as diverse data as possible. But this requirement is there's a contradictory with the core requirement for the data protection law. We focus on the data minimization. We need to collect data for particular purpose. So any data further processing outside of this purpose, we need to find another kind of either consent or another legal basis. So now we face the issue is just very much like Italy is how can we make the signal use of data be lawful and be responsible? One is what kind of consent model we would like to design, but for retrospectively, how can we expand the original specific consent in order to repurposing data for other kind of research? And also there are lots is commercial assets at the later stage of research. So we see lots of public-private partnership. I think it's in the UK and in Taiwan as well. And lots of private partnership, they would like to collaborate with our national health insurance database to access data to save lots costs to recollecting data by themselves. So how can we do the transparent and accountable governance, especially under this PPP model? And when we talk about the privacy impact assessment, actually in Taiwan now, the PRA is not like the EU GDPR. We didn't really make it a compulsory requirement. So now in practice, all these kind of requirements, they are very only limit to focus only on the data security. So we try to see whether the de-identification, anonymization, compliant with the ISO regulation, but we forget actually the whole context of privacy impact assessment doesn't really focus on data, especially we need to consider participants' reasonable expectation. So we also need to find a lawful basis and moving it to the fairness and accuracy as well. So for the public-private partnership, actually, I think it was 2 years ago, my postdoc and I, we published a paper at Computer Law and Security Review. We especially want to examine the GDPR scientific exception, because now under the GDPR rules, actually, so long as the scientific research, so long as it's for the scientific research, actually, there's no requirement to distinguish it's carried out by the public institute, academic institute, or commercial entities. Yeah. So we want to see whether this kind of derogation is really adequate and enough, especially for the commercial research. We understand that there's no any requirement as just Hai-Hong just mentioned about, let's ask a review, carry on in the academic researchers, we need to follow up, or we need to comply with a very strict IRB review. So in this paper, we see that we want to argue that actually for the commercial entities, if they would like to apply for scientific research or scientific research derogation or exemption, and it requires to satisfy some conditions. The first one is that we need to have a public interest. And later on, I will explain a little bit about the different layer of public interest we try to offer. And also we argue that you need to have a research ethics committee involved right before the research being carried out. Because now if we want to make the data governance be more to require the corporation to comply with like transparency requirement. Sometimes in practice, we just face the difficulty so long as the government say, oh, no, we cannot really disclose because it's our nation, it's our corporate secret, or it's based on the OPL algorithm. So I think there are some barriers to the oversight, and this kind of oversight isn't really not very easy to recover only by the data governance framework. And we need to pose some other restriction on the commercial use, especially commercial use for AI research. And now is that I think some colleagues might be quite familiar with the Google DeMine case. It was happened a few years in the UK. Is that it's also involved like secondary use of the national health insurance data in the UK. And I use this case as a way to explain a little bit what's happening in Taiwan, because we face very, very similar things. And the Google DeMine want to develop a new app. It's called Streams. Yeah, it's called Stream, and we can download this app on our mobile phones. And the business model is that it costs too much to collect data by Google itself. So just develop a data transfer agreement with Royal Free Hospital is under the NHS UK. And now, based on this data sharing agreement, actually the Google DeMine is able to access, I think it's 1.6 million patients' data without any de-identification. So the Information Commission Office in the UK just say this kind of data sharing agreement violate the data protection law in the UK. And I think there's a little bit different from Taiwanese context that we doesn't really have, we don't have the ICO. So we haven't really had the Information Commission Office as an independent role to supervise, especially when the government turns to be the biggest data user or biggest data controller. So, and also in this case, because the data transfer, it doesn't really have the patient's consent, and it just, it also doesn't really comply with the identification. And the current practice in Taiwan, we have lots this public-private partnership. We often just use the de-identification to replace consent. So there's a little bit different, but I think the principle is quite similar. It's just the company want to use the public database for their commercial use for AI development. So now we see the PPP model, the public-private partnership. I think how can we do a good and data governance model for, especially for PPP? I think the first principle is that we do need to articulate what public benefits are. And we have to tell the participant to let them understand what the public benefits really are. They really promote health or find a good way for the better treatment, or it's just benefit a particular commercial entity. And also, we probably need to have a rearrangement mechanism to rearranging the equity and fair distribution of benefit. And this kind of arrangement can be two parts. One is that we can arrange like a co-ownership of the APP if it's possible. And also, if there's a benefit, I think probably we can have a pre-contract rearrangement to require a certain percentage goes back to the national health insurance system. I think all these ways will be increase the public trust, especially for this PPP model. Also, we need to make this public-private partnership be more transparent at the very beginning. So the government probably need to disclose if there's a PPP involved. And also for the data governance, probably we can establish a joint governance body to guide the data sharing process altogether. So here back to the Taiwanese context, just last year we have a constitutional core constitutional lawsuit. It's regarding with the secondary use of our national health insurance database. And in Taiwan, the national health insurance is compulsory. So we, the hospital, because they need to climb the they need to kind of a reimbursement of the money back from the government. So it's very easy for the government just automatically collect all this data, turn it as a image data for the checking purpose. Yeah, so we have this NHI big data database is include like a medical image data, image reports, or some testing data. And this data, the original purpose is just for the administrative checking, but it's very useful for the research as well. So now there are lots of collaboration, especially public-private partnership want to use this data for secondary use, especially for research purpose, also for AI application. And now we face the same issue as about the secondary use of NHI data. And the problem is that in Taiwan, we doesn't really have legal basis. We doesn't really have opt-in consent because it's a hospital's reimbursement purpose. So we doesn't really have opt-in consent. And before that lawsuit, actually, we didn't really allow people to opt out from the secondary use of this NHI database, because the government say all this data has already been de-identified. So it's probably just too costly to make everyone to opt out. And so in the Taiwanese case, we just highly rely on de-identification and also public interest. I think because public benefit, we didn't really give it a clear definition. So all the PPP model, public interest, public-private partnership, we still treat it as a kind of public interest inside. So we use these two components together, but we didn't really have a clear definition about how can we do the de-identification. We don't have a code of practice on that. So I think that recently, just lots of people try to argue, we have to notify the limitation of de-identification. And we have to distinguish two different concepts. One is about data security, and the other one is about the privacy protection. And the other one talks more about autonomy and data control. So here is my other research is I try to distinguish a little bit about the different layer of public interest. So doing this research is try to figure out what kind of consent model, whether it's opt-in consent or whether it's opt-out consent, under what kind of context and scenario, especially for individual cases, that we can adopt in order to help the National Health Insurance to find the proper legal basis. So based on that, I try to distinguish three different kind of public interests. As we know that for the COVID period, I think we have definitely very high substantial public interest. So during that particular case, and I think it's okay to restrict the consent a little bit. We can just use data without asking people or even restrict people's right to opt out. But sometimes we just have a very general public interest. And now we need to consider what kind of de-identification technique we use. If we make data to be completely de-identified, for example, we just follow the GDPR's rule to make it anonymized. And because it's already anonymized, even though this anonymized is still debatable, and probably we can still restrict the opt-out. But in general, it's just most of the cases we just make data pseudonymized because of some requirement to follow up of the data subject. And for that case, I think we do need to have opt-out in order to satisfy the consent requirement. And still, I think the same, if the data hasn't really been de-identified, and we still need to opt out. And in some special cases, probably a low public interest cases or for commercial use cases, I would suggest that we just use opt-in consent in order to get more trust for the participant. So just before the lawsuit, we also try to use another kind of digital platform to solve this without consent basis for the processing of NHI data for secondary use. In Taiwan, we have this My Health Bank app. We can easily download this on the cell phone. And during the COVID period, actually, the enrollment rate for this My Health Bank is dramatically increasing. So now it's I think it's over 7 million, and now it's almost 1/3 of the total population in Taiwan. So it's very useful platform. And in 2021, we just did a survey. I think it's a trial as well, because at that time we are still waiting for a constitutional court's decision. So we did a survey and used this app to ask people's opinion, whether they are happy to remain their health data in the NHI database for the secondary use, or they would like to opt out. And for the commercial use, we asked them whether they would like to give their consent to make the NHI to use their data. So here are the questionnaires that we asked. And we can see the first question we asked is, would you be willing to provide your personal data for academic research if in the future you have this option to decide, and like the data will have been de-identified. So we ask this question, and we can see the rate to say agree is actually not very high. Probably people at the very well will think, wow, 82% is quite high. But if you think the other way, is that probably means we have over 15% people will decide to opt out. It's a very, very huge number. So because this question just in Chinese, we use a double negative. So during this survey, we actually changed the questionnaire, the wording a little bit to make it more clear and to make it more straightforward. So we just say, revise the wording, we say, would you like to continue to provide? Because their data is already in the National Health Database. And we can see the consent, the agree rate actually increased a little bit, but there are still 60.8% not give their consent. So second question, we focus on the commercial use. So we just ask the same question, whether you would be happy to provide your personal data for commercial use if in the future that we use the identification technology. And we just say the purpose is for the development of smart healthcare. We try to say a little bit about on the purpose. So now we see actually this opt-in rate is also, we have 83%. So in general, we can see actually, we're not quite sure because it's just a survey. We prepare for the constitutional court's decision during lifetime, but we were not quite sure. But compared to the UK opt-out rate, we can see in Taiwan's context, actually the opt-out rate could be quite high. Yeah, and there are some challenge for these high opt-out rates. One is that we will face a compromise database, and also we talk about the inadequate representative because it is really random opt-out. So we're not quite sure who is going to opt out from the database. Also, based on some research in other jurisdictions, actually we see usually for the particular group who are not comfortable to have their data to be shared for research are usually the particular group who need access to healthcare most. So we're not quite sure whether this will increase the so-called health inequality for the groups of have-nots. So here we can see a paper, it was published a few years ago. It goes back to the UK context to talking about the NHS data. We just say now is the national data opt-out programs that are carried out in the UK. Just say, focus on the opt-out rate and say it will have some bad impact on the small area perspective, small area population, especially for this, especially for the minority group. So, just last year in August, we have this constitutional court decision, and not surprised, just the court just say, well, the second use of the national health insurance data without a proper consent, either is opt-in or opt-out, without a lawful basis is unconstitutional. So the court says that within 3 years, it requires to have a specific law or legal amendment to allow opt-out. It just says quite clearly on the constitutional court's decision. So now we have to since the decision has been issued until now, it's just lots meetings talking about how can we design this opt-out mechanism, what's the general principle and what's the exception for the opt-out, and lots discussion on these issues. And think back to the concluding remarks, I think using Taiwanese case as an example, we're talking about how can we set up a transparent, accountable data governance mechanism. I think the most important is always we need to try to find a balance between individual autonomy and fair data use. And how can we find this balance is quite important. And also for the data governance framework, I think we talk about the PPP model. I think the most important thing is that we need to disclose and we need to state clearly what the public benefits are and what kind of benefit sharing in the future, and we need to disclose that at the very beginning. And also in Taiwanese case, we can see there's a quite interesting moving. It's moving from the confidentiality. Before, we just highly rely on the de-identification. So we only focus on the data itself. We don't really try to deal with consent. And now with the Constitutional Court decision, and now with last discussion on the legitimate significant use of health data, and now we're moving a little bit from the confidentiality to the consent. So we don't focus only on data security, we focus on autonomy and data control. And now we've been thinking like whether we need to move also from consent to accountability as well, especially for AI application. And if we rely on about, I think about is just one way to express consent, but you need to still needs last supplement by the good accountability and governance framework. So now we need to set up a good, transparent, and accountable data governance framework in order to make this opt-out still be able to be implemented and still be able to get the social trust. I think for the use of AI or for the use of health and genomic data for the AI application, the most important is how can we set up a good mechanism to increase public trust, to increase public engagement. And the Taiwanese case, I think it shows that still the consent still plays quite important role, but we're at the same time we're trying to set up a good governance framework. We also use digital platform to make consent be easier to be implemented. So I hope to share the Taiwanese experience with you and look forward to more discussion with you all. Thank you so much.